Custer's last message was not a speech, a final salute, or a sentence spoken for history. It was a hurried note moving through the dust of the Little Bighorn, carried by a cavalry trumpeter whose horse was taking him away from 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry. The paper was pale against the dark leather of the saddle. Its pencil marks were brief and uneven, written for immediate use rather than preservation. Benteen. Come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. W. Cook. Those few lines contained no farewell. They did not describe Custer's position, explain his plan, or warn that his battalion might soon be beyond help. They named a man, announced a large village, demanded speed, and repeated one practical instruction: bring the packs. The rider carrying the message was Giovanni Martini, an Italian immigrant later known in the United States as John Martin. He was a trumpeter in Company H, though on this afternoon his most important instrument was not the brass trumpet attached to his gear. It was the folded paper placed in his keeping. Martini guided his horse away from Custer's column and into the uneven country above the Little Bighorn River. Dust rose beneath the animal's hooves. Dry grass brushed its lower legs. Behind him, mounted figures moved along the ridges and gradually disappeared as the ground folded between them. The vanishing happened quickly. A few moments earlier, Martini had been close to Custer, Lieutenant William Weir Cook, and the 5 companies advancing with them. Then a ridge came between the messenger and the command. Men who had been visible became shapes. The shapes became dust. Soon there was only the route ahead and the knowledge that Captain Frederick Benteen was somewhere beyond it. The note Martini carried is usually called Custer's last message, but Custer did not put pencil to paper. The handwriting belonged to Lieutenant Cook, the 7th Cavalry's adjutant. Custer gave the verbal order, and Cook wrote it down for Martini to deliver. That distinction matters. Cook was not composing a record for future historians. He was trying to make a battlefield command clear. Martini spoke English with a noticeable Italian accent and had been in the United States for only a few years. Amid moving horses, wind, gunfire, and hurried instructions, spoken words could be altered or forgotten. Written words offered something firmer. The paper could be handed directly to Benteen. It could identify the sender. It could preserve the essential phrases, even if the messenger arrived tired, breathless, or uncertain of how to repeat every word. Yet writing also had limits. Cook could only place on the page what was known and important at that moment. He could not describe events that had not happened. He could not tell Benteen what Reno's battalion would soon endure, where the pack train would be when the message arrived, or how quickly Custer's own situation might change. The order was already growing older, with every stride of Martini's horse. For now, however, the message was simple. Benteen had been sent away with 3 companies to examine country southwest of the main line of advance. Custer wanted him called back toward the village. He also wanted the packs brought forward. Those packs were not ordinary baggage. Somewhere behind the faster cavalry companies, mules carried reserve ammunition and other supplies. They moved more slowly than mounted soldiers. Their loads had to remain balanced. Straggling animals had to be recovered. Narrow paths, steep slopes, and rough ground could stretch the train into a long and vulnerable line. Custer was therefore asking for 2 things that did not naturally travel at the same speed. He wanted Benteen's companies quickly, and he wanted the slower pack train with them. Cook wrote the request once, then added it again as a postscript. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. The repetition is the most revealing feature of the message. Whatever Custer intended to do near the northern end of the village, additional ammunition mattered enough for Cook to make certain the instruction could not be missed. But the note did not say where the packs were. It did not explain how Benteen should gather them while also moving quickly. It offered urgency without a route, and purpose without a complete picture. Martini could not solve those problems. His task was narrower. Find Benteen. Deliver the paper. He rode across ground that refused to behave like the clean lines of a military map. Low ridges blocked his view. Coulées opened beside the trail and then narrowed again. Every rise offered a brief look ahead, but the view vanished as soon as the horse descended. There may have been distant firing, carried unevenly through the warm afternoon air. A few reports could sound close, then faint. A rider could hear a battle without knowing precisely where it was being fought, or which part of the regiment was involved. Martini kept moving. The leather creaked beneath him. Metal fittings tapped softly against the saddle. Sweat darkened the horse's coat where the tack pressed against it. The paper remained protected against his body or inside his clothing, safe from the dust gathering on nearly everything else. Behind him, Custer's 5 companies were no longer visible. That simple fact would later give Martini's ride a deeper meaning. The order did more than carry him toward Benteen. It removed him from the battalion shortly before its final fighting. What was meant as a routine messenger duty became his passage out of a command from which no other direct messenger would return, with a clearer written explanation. Martini could not have known this while riding. He was not carrying a relic, he was carrying work. Somewhere ahead, Benteen was returning from his reconnaissance. Somewhere behind, the pack mules labored forward. Reno's battalion was moving toward a separate crisis in the valley. Custer continued along ground hidden from the other parts of his regiment. The paper was supposed to draw these separated pieces closer together, and in one narrow sense, it succeeded. Martini found Benteen. The message was delivered. Its recipient read the words. The packs were eventually brought forward. Yet Custer and the men riding with him were not saved. That is the quiet contradiction at the center of the story. The note was not lost. The messenger did not fail to arrive. The order did not vanish in the grass or fall beneath a horse's hooves. It reached the man whose name appeared on the first line. But while Martini rode, the battlefield continued to change. Every ridge concealed a new development. Every minute altered what the order could accomplish. By the time the paper passed into Benteen's hands, its words would have to compete with events Cook had never written down. And before we can understand why those few lines were not enough, we must look beyond the moving note, beyond the saddle leather and dust, to the larger struggle that brought the 7th Cavalry into the valley on that June afternoon. To understand why those hurried words were written, we have to move back from the afternoon dust and look at the valley before it became a battlefield. At dawn, the Little Bighorn River curved quietly through cottonwood trees and open grass. Thin smoke rose from cooking fires. Hundreds of lodges stood in broad circles along the water, their pale coverings catching the first light. Beyond them, horse herds spread across the nearby slopes, watched by riders who had risen before the heat of the day. This was not simply a military camp waiting for soldiers to arrive. It was a moving community. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne families had gathered there, along with a smaller number of Arapaho people. Children carried water. Women tended fires, prepared food, repaired clothing, and arranged the belongings that traveled with each household. Hunters checked weapons and horses. Elders sat near lodge entrances as morning activity began around them. Dogs moved between the camps. Wooden lodge poles, folded hides, cooking vessels, blankets, tools, and bundles recorded the practical life of people who had traveled across the northern plains for generations. Warriors were present in large numbers, but so were parents, grandparents, infants, and young people who had no command position and no military plan. The village existed because families had chosen to come together during the warm season. They visited relatives, held ceremonies, exchanged news, hunted, and allowed their horses to feed on good grass. Some leaders and bands had spent time near government agencies. Others continued to live beyond reservation boundaries, following older patterns of movement through hunting country they considered their own. From the ground inside the village, The morning did not necessarily look like the beginning of one of the most famous battles in American history. It looked like another summer day beside a river. A woman might pull a hide covering tighter, where the night wind had loosened it. A child might lead a pony by a rawhide rope. A man might step away from the lodges and study the eastern hills, not because he could see the 7th Cavalry, but because watching distant ground was part of life in a country where news often arrived on horseback. Far beyond those lodge circles, Army columns were trying to find them. The campaign of 1876 had grown from years of broken agreements, expanding settlement, contested land, and increasing federal pressure. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had brought miners into territory recognized for Lakota use under earlier agreements. Roads, camps, and military interests followed. Attempts to purchase the hills failed, and the government then demanded that Native people living outside the reservation agencies report to designated locations during the winter. For many families, that demand was neither simple nor practical. The distances were great. Winter travel was difficult. Some bands had little reason to trust promises made by officials. Others did not accept that Washington could decide where they must live or when they must abandon hunting grounds. When the deadline passed, those who remained outside the agencies were treated as hostile. The word was convenient for military planning. It was less useful for understanding the people to whom it was applied. A family traveling with Sitting Bull's Hunkpapa Lakota did not become a military unit merely because it remained beyond an agency boundary. A Northern Cheyenne household did not cease to be a household because soldiers had been ordered to locate it. Yet federal policy increasingly turned movement, hunting, and refusal into matters for armed enforcement. By the spring of 1876, several Army forces were moving through the northern plains. Their purpose was to find the non-reservation bands, bring them to battle if necessary, and compel them to submit. That task sounded clearer in written orders than it was on the ground. The country was immense. Rivers twisted behind bluffs. Trails divided and disappeared. Rain could erase tracks, while dry weather could create so much dust that distant movement became difficult to judge. There was no radio communication, no aircraft looking down from above, and no instant way for separated columns to share what they had found. Officers depended on maps that were often incomplete, reports that might already be old, and scouts who understood the land far better than most of the soldiers following them. Crow and Arikara scouts traveled with the Army during the campaign. Their presence carried its own long history. The Crow had endured conflict with Lakota and Cheyenne expansion into lands they considered theirs. Arikara scouts also had distinct political interests, experiences, and reasons for serving. They were not merely guides placed beside the cavalry for color. They read the country, interpreted trails, examined campsites, and made judgments that could determine where an entire command moved. A bent stem of grass could show that horses had passed. A cold fire pit could suggest how long a camp had been empty. The depth of a hoofprint, the width of a trail, and the number of abandoned lodge poles might reveal whether the travelers ahead were a small hunting party or something much larger. On the morning of June 25th, such signs mattered more than any polished parade ground formation. Scouts studying the country understood that a great many people were nearby. Trails widened. Fresh traces multiplied. The evidence on the ground suggested horses and families in numbers that could not easily be counted from one ridge. Still, knowing that a village existed was not the same as knowing its exact size. The encampment followed the river for a considerable distance. Cottonwoods and bends concealed portions of it. Lodges that appeared separate from one viewpoint joined into a much broader gathering when seen from another. Horse herds extended beyond the living areas, making the whole scene larger still. Even those inside the village could not see every lodge from where they stood. That hidden scale would shape nearly every decision made during the coming hours. Army officers feared that the village might scatter if warned. Previous campaigns had taught them how quickly native families could break camp and move across country that seemed almost empty to an outsider. Surprise, therefore, appeared valuable. Delay appeared dangerous. But speed carried its own risk. A fast column could arrive before the enemy dispersed, yet it could also enter unfamiliar ground before officers understood what waited there. Men could become separated. Supply animals could fall behind. One part of a regiment might hear fighting without seeing the troops involved. The same mobility that made the village difficult to capture also made it difficult to measure. Along the river, morning fires continued to burn. Horses were moved toward better grazing. People exchanged visits between lodge circles. News began to pass that soldiers had been seen or that scouts had discovered signs of an approaching force. The change may not have reached every family at once, but awareness spread. Men walked toward their horses. Weapons were checked. Riders moved out to examine the distant hills. The peaceful appearance of the valley had not vanished, but it had altered. Ordinary objects remained where they had been. Bowls near fires, folded blankets, lodge poles reaching into the sky. Now those objects stood beside preparations made in response to approaching danger. Many miles away, the 7th Cavalry followed the broad trail toward the Little Bighorn. Its officers still did not possess a complete view of the community ahead. They knew they had found the route. They believed the village might attempt to escape. They had to decide how quickly to move and how widely to search. The central problem was already present. The Army was trying to control a large mobile gathering while seeing only fragments of it. The people in the valley were trying to protect families and freedom while receiving only fragments of information about the soldiers approaching them. Between the two lay ridges, river bends, dust, and time. Before Cook's pencil touched the page, communication was already failing across the landscape. Orders had to be carried by men. Observations had to be interpreted. Separate groups had to trust that the others would be where they were expected to be. And as the 7th Cavalry drew closer to the river, its 12 companies were about to stop moving as one body. The change began on the high, open country east of the Little Bighorn, where the broad trace left by the village curved toward the river, and the mounted regiment paused long enough for new orders to pass from officer to officer. A scout pointed across the rolling hills. Another rider studied the wide trail pressed into the grass by thousands of hooves, lodge poles, dogs, and burdened animals. Saddles creaked as men leaned forward to look. Somewhere ahead, hidden by ridges and cottonwood bottoms, lay the gathering they had been following. The 7th Cavalry had 12 companies on the field that afternoon. From a distance, it could still appear to be one command. Hundreds of blue-coated soldiers, horses, guidons, officers, scouts, and supply animals traveling toward the same river. But it was about to become 4 separate bodies. George Armstrong Custer kept 5 companies with him. Major Marcus Reno received 3. Captain Frederick Benteen received another 3, and was directed toward the left, or southwest, to search country beyond the main line of march. The remaining company, Company B under Captain Thomas McDougall, stayed with the ammunition and supply train behind the faster troops. The division did not happen as a dramatic ceremony. There was no large map spread across a polished table. No one stood above the country with a complete view of every ridge and bend. Instructions passed in the saddle, surrounded by dust, tired animals, and incomplete information. An officer listened, turned his horse, and rode toward his men. A guidon shifted direction. One company followed, then another. Within minutes, lines of riders that had approached together began peeling away across different parts of the landscape. Reno's battalion, approximately 140 men, moved toward the valley and the southern end of the native encampment. His task was the most direct. He was to advance, cross the river if possible, and strike the village from below while other elements supported the movement. Benteen's 3 companies, about 125 men, angled away toward rougher country on the left. His assignment was reconnaissance. He was to examine the ridges and valleys to the southwest and determine whether more of the village, or groups attempting to escape, lay in that direction. Custer's 5 companies, roughly 210 officers and enlisted men, remained on the more northerly route. His movement would eventually carry them along the bluffs above the river, out of direct sight of both Reno and Benteen. Behind everyone came the 4th body, the pack train and its escort. It did not move like cavalry prepared for a charge. It moved at the pace of heavily loaded mules. Wooden ammunition boxes hung in balanced loads. Blankets, tools, food, medical material, and other supplies were tied down with ropes and straps. A load that slipped had to be stopped and adjusted. A mule that wandered had to be turned back. When the path narrowed, the train stretched into a long file that could not quickly close the space between its front and rear. The soldiers ahead could ask for speed. The animals behind could only give what the weight and terrain allowed. Dividing a mounted regiment was not automatically reckless by the standards of 19th century warfare. Cavalry frequently separated into smaller commands to scout, pursue, block escape routes, or approach a position from more than one direction. A single long column could see only what lay directly in front of it. Separate battalions could examine more country and apply pressure from several sides. Under the right conditions, division created flexibility, but every separation also created a new need. Someone had to know where the other groups were. Someone had to carry fresh orders when the original plan changed. Each commander had to assume that the others understood the intention and would arrive close enough to the expected time. On June 25th, none of those conditions could be guaranteed. The hills offered brief views rather than continuous observation. A line of soldiers could appear on a crest, descend into a coulee, and disappear completely. Even when 2 groups were less than a few miles apart, the folds of the earth could make them seem absent. Custer could not watch Benteen's reconnaissance once the 3 companies turned southwest. Benteen could not see the river valley where Reno was advancing. Reno could not know precisely where Custer intended to cross or when the 5-company battalion would appear in support. The packers could not see what need for ammunition might be developing ahead of them. For a while, the separation remained orderly. Men adjusted their reins and followed their assigned officers. Hooves pressed separate tracks into the dry grass. Dust began rising in several directions rather than one. From a high enough point, an observer might have seen 4 distinct movements, one turning left, one descending toward the river, one continuing northward, and one laboring behind them with the reserve supplies. It was a clear arrangement when viewed from above. No one there could view it from above. Each group carried only a fragment of the larger picture. Reno knew that he was approaching the lower edge of the encampment, but not how many warriors could assemble against him. Benteen knew that he had been sent to examine the left, but not what Custer would discover while he was gone. Custer knew that a broad trail led toward a major gathering, but the true length and population of that gathering were still only partly visible. McDougal and the packers knew that their loads were essential, but not which battalion would need them first. There was another complication. The 4 bodies did not begin the separation with equal speed. Custer's and Reno's mounted troops could increase their pace when ordered. Benteen's battalion could move quickly once its search was finished, although its horses had already traveled hard. The supply train could not match them. The farther the combat companies advanced, the longer the ammunition reserve required to reach them. This created a quiet imbalance inside the plan. The most rapidly changing events would occur at the front. The means of sustaining those events remained behind. At first, this gap may not have seemed alarming. Soldiers often fought with the ammunition carried in their belts and saddle equipment before drawing on the reserve. The pack train was meant to follow. If all went well, the separate battalions would remain close enough to support one another, and the supplies would arrive before they became urgently necessary. But the plan depended on time behaving gently. It depended on the village responding as expected. It depended on each commander finding what he had been sent to find. Already, one of those assumptions was beginning to fail. As Benteen rode toward the southwest, the broad signs of the encampment became less obvious rather than more. The country ahead showed ridges, ravines, dry grass, and distant horizons, but not the additional camps or escaping families he had been ordered to locate. Meanwhile, Reno moved closer to the river. Custer continued toward higher ground. The mules fell farther behind. The regiment still had one name, one commanding officer, and one general purpose. Yet physically, it was no longer one force. It had become 4 moving parts, each seeing a different landscape and carrying a different portion of the day's burden. Soon, bringing those parts together again would require more than an order shouted between nearby riders. It would require a messenger, and before that messenger was chosen, Benteen's 3 companies had to ride deeper into country that appeared almost entirely empty. The 3 companies sent toward the southwest left the broad village trace behind and entered a harsher, less certain landscape. Captain Frederick Benteen rode near the front with companies D, H, and K following through broken ridges and shallow gullies. Around 125 officers and enlisted men moved with him. Their assignment was simple to state, but difficult to complete. Search the country to the left of the regiment's advance and determine whether part of the encampment, a second camp, or groups attempting to escape could be found there. At first, the riders could still see signs of the movement they had been following. Hoofprints crossed patches of bare earth. Grass had been bent under passing animals. Dust hung faintly above distant slopes. Then the signs weakened. The battalion climbed a long rise under the afternoon sun. Horses breathed heavily through their nostrils. Leather tack creaked with each step. Canteens tapped against saddles, and metal bits gave small, regular sounds as the animals worked upward. When Benteen reached the crest, he raised a hand. The column slowed. Men pulled gently on their reins and spread along the high ground. Some stood in their stirrups. Others shaded their eyes with a gloved hand and studied the open country ahead. There were ridges, low valleys, patches of pale grass, and distant shapes that seemed to move when heat trembled above the earth. But there was no visible encampment, no lodge tops, no broad horse herd, no line of families leaving the river. A dark mark on a far slope might be a mounted rider. After several moments, it became clear that it was probably brush or exposed earth. A small cloud of dust might suggest movement. Then it thinned without revealing anyone beneath it. Reconnaissance often consisted of such waiting. An officer could not simply glance once and declare the land empty. Horses might be hidden in a ravine. Riders could remain below the crest of a ridge. A group traveling quickly might leave only brief signs before disappearing into another fold of the hills. Benteen had to decide whether the absence before him was real or merely concealed. He sent men farther along the high ground. Scouts and soldiers examined the approaches. The battalion moved again, descending into a gully where the open horizon vanished behind steep banks. At the bottom, the air felt stiller. Hooves struck dry earth and loose stone. The men could see only the narrow way ahead and the strip of sky above them. Then they climbed again. Another horizon appeared. It was empty too. The search was taking Benteen away from the river and away from the other parts of the 7th Cavalry. Yet he was not wandering without purpose. He was following the direction he had been ordered to examine. That fact would later become important. Benteen and Custer did not enjoy a warm relationship. Benteen was experienced, blunt, and independent. He had little affection for Custer's reputation or command style, and his private comments could be sharply critical. Years of argument after the Little Bighorn would encourage some people to view every choice Benteen made through the lens of that hostility. But personal dislike does not explain why he was riding southwest that afternoon. Custer had sent him there. The search itself created the separation that would soon become a problem. Every additional ridge examined placed Benteen farther from the point where events were beginning to gather. Every descent into a ravine removed the battalion from sight. If an order came recalling him, a messenger would first have to discover where the 3 companies had gone. The country did not provide convenient signs. There were no marked roads and no posts showing distance back to the main line. The riders navigated by ridges, drainage cuts, direction, and memory of the route already traveled. A commander could estimate where the rest of the regiment might be, but that estimate changed as every group continued moving. Benteen halted again on another rise. The horses stood in an uneven line, some lowering their heads, others turning their ears toward sounds too faint for the men to identify. Dust settled slowly around their legs. One rider dismounted to adjust a loosened strap. Another checked the ground for tracks and found nothing that suggested a large body of people had recently passed. The visible consequence was clear. The battalion had spent time and horseflesh searching a direction that appeared to hold no part of the great encampment. Benteen now faced a practical choice. He could continue farther, hoping that the next ridge would reveal what the previous ridges had hidden, or he could conclude that the search had gone far enough and turn back toward the regiment's line of advance. Too early a return might leave an escape route unexamined. Too late a return might make his companies unavailable when they were needed elsewhere. No clock could tell him the correct moment. He could not see what Reno was encountering near the river. He did not know how much of the encampment Custer had observed. He had received no new report describing a crisis. From Benteen's position, the afternoon was still a reconnaissance problem, not yet a rescue. This difference in knowledge is essential. Later observers would know that the hours were narrowing. They would know that 5 companies were moving toward their final battlefield. Benteen knew only what lay before him: tired mounts, difficult terrain, and no sign that the encampment extended southwest. At last, the order was given to turn. Riders shifted their horses. The companies changed direction across the ridge. Men who had been looking into the empty distance now faced back toward the broad trace they had left behind. The decision ended the outward search, but it did not erase the cost of making it. The animals had climbed and descended repeatedly. Some had been ridden hard during the long approach to the Little Bighorn. Returning north did not place Benteen instantly beside Custer. It merely began the ride back. The battalion moved at a measured pace. There was reason not to exhaust the horses without a visible emergency. Mounted troops depended on their animals for movement, attack, retreat, and the transport of equipment. A horse pushed beyond its remaining strength could transform a rider into a man on foot in open country. Benteen therefore had to preserve enough speed for whatever might come later. The men followed the reverse line through gullies and across rising slopes. Landmarks appeared from unfamiliar angles. The ridges that had hidden the empty southwest now concealed the route toward the river. Occasionally, someone looked north or east for another body of soldiers. Nothing definite appeared. The separation remained invisible. In the distance, there may have been faint sounds, but no clear message yet reached the battalion. A few scattered reports could be mistaken for hunting, distant skirmishing, or sound carried from a direction difficult to judge. Until a rider arrived with information, Benteen had no way to know how quickly the situation elsewhere was changing. So the 3 companies continued back through the dry hills, carrying their carbines, canteens, and the result of their search. They had found no second camp. They had found no large escape movement. They had found only open country. Yet that emptiness had consumed valuable time and drawn a substantial part of the regiment away from the valley. The mission had answered one question while quietly creating another. How soon could Benteen be brought back if Custer suddenly needed him? Far to the northeast, the answer was already becoming urgent. While Benteen's riders turned through the empty ridges, Custer's 5 companies were approaching higher ground above the Little Bighorn. From there, the scattered signs along the river would begin to join into a single, immense view. While Benteen's 3 companies turned back through the empty southwestern ridges, the 5 companies with Custer were entering a very different landscape. The ground ahead began to fall away toward the Little Bighorn. Narrow drainage cuts opened between the bluffs. Dry slopes descended toward greener cottonwood bottoms, and beyond them the river curved through the valley in flashes of reflected light. Custer's column moved north along the higher country, sometimes close enough to the edge for officers and scouts to look down, then disappearing again behind the next rise. The view came in pieces. First, there were scattered lodge tops, then smoke above the trees, then horse herds spreading across pale grass. Each new elevation revealed more than the one before it. Near the front, men reined in briefly and looked across the valley. Custer was there with Lieutenant William Weir Cook, the regimental adjutant, and other officers close to the head of the column. A scout indicated the river bottoms. Another rider shifted his position for a clearer view. What appeared below was not a compact camp arranged around a single circle. The lodges continued along the river, partly concealed by bends, cottonwoods, and uneven ground. A cluster visible near one stretch of water was followed by another farther north. Horse herds extended beyond the living areas. Dust rose from movement inside and around the encampment. The village was large. Precisely how much Custer could see from any one point remains uncertain. The Bluffs did not offer a perfect overlook, and no surviving member of his immediate command later described his thoughts. What can be said more carefully is that the signs before him suggested a gathering far greater than a few isolated bands. That changed the practical meaning of the afternoon. Reno had already been directed toward the southern end with 3 companies. Benteen was somewhere behind and to the left. Returning from country, Custer could no longer observe. The ammunition train remained farther back, working at the speed of its loaded mules. The regiment had been divided to find and pressure a mobile encampment. Now the scale of that encampment made separation more dangerous. Below the bluffs, movement spread through the lodge circles. Riders crossed patches of open grass. Horses were being caught and saddled. Figures gathered near the edges of the camp and moved toward the southern end, where Reno's battalion was approaching. From above, some of that activity may have looked like flight. Some may have looked like resistance forming. Much of it was probably impossible to interpret with certainty. Dust concealed details. Cottonwood leaves blocked lines of sight. A rider, moving quickly between lodges, could be carrying a warning, collecting a horse, searching for relatives, or preparing to fight. To an officer watching from a ridge, all of those actions became movement inside a single, immense scene. Custer had to make decisions without knowing which interpretation was correct. If the village was beginning to scatter, speed still mattered. If large numbers of warriors were gathering, reinforcement mattered more. If Reno was already heavily engaged, coordination had become urgent. The problem was that the men who could strengthen Custer's position were no longer beside him. Benteen's battalion could not be called by trumpet. The folds of the land and the miles between them made musical signals useless. The pack train could not be hurried forward by intention alone. Reno was already moving on a separate course below. The command now depended on riders carrying words between bodies of troops that could no longer see one another. Cook's place near Custer was important for exactly this reason. As adjutant, he served close to regimental headquarters. His duties included helping transmit, organize, and clarify commands. On a parade field, an order might pass cleanly down a visible line. Here, every instruction had to survive movement. A messenger needed to find the correct officer. The officer needed to understand what had changed. Then men and animals had to cross the same terrain the message had crossed, only in greater numbers and at a slower pace. Near the head of Medicine Tail Coulee, Custer's route approached one of the natural cuts leading down toward the river. The coulee offered a possible way into the valley, but it also narrowed sight. From high ground, the village could be observed in fragments. Inside the drainage, The bluffs would rise on either side and conceal much of what lay beyond. The battalion paused or slowed as officers examined the country. A horse turned sideways on the slope. Dust settled across its neck. Cook remained near Custer, close enough to receive an instruction that would soon be sent away from the column. The moment did not need to appear dramatic to carry enormous consequence. There may have been no sudden silence, no sense that history had arrived. Men adjusted equipment. Scouts watched the valley. Officers spoke over the ordinary sounds of breathing animals, leather, and distant activity below. But one fact had become difficult to ignore. The force ahead was larger than expected. Custer had roughly 210 men with him. Reno had about 140. Benteen had approximately 125. The remaining escort and pack train personnel were scattered behind with the supplies. The native gathering contained thousands of people, though no officer on the bluffs could have produced a reliable count. The number of warriors available to respond was likewise uncertain, but it was far greater than the small groups cavalry units had sometimes pursued across the plains. The visible village therefore created a pressure that no single observation could resolve. Should Custer wait for the regiment to gather? Should he keep moving while surprise remained possible? Should he seek another crossing? Should he support Reno directly, or continue north in hopes of striking a different part of the encampment? The surviving evidence does not allow us to enter his mind and select one complete answer. What it does show is his next practical action. He called for Benteen. That decision tells us something important. Whatever Custer's larger plan may have been, he now wanted the 3 companies sent southwest, moving back toward him. The reconnaissance mission had lost its value, compared with the need to concentrate strength. He also wanted the ammunition reserve. This was not yet the language of farewell. It was the language of a commander attempting to pull separated resources toward a developing situation. But spoken instructions alone were vulnerable. The chosen messenger would have to remember a name, a warning, an order to hurry, and a demand involving the slow supply column. Wind and gunfire could blur the words. An accent could complicate their repetition. Fatigue could remove a phrase that seemed secondary, but was not. Cook therefore needed something more durable than a shouted sentence. Around him, the scene continued changing. Riders appeared along the valley floor. Dust thickened near the southern portion of the encampment. Reno's approach was drawing attention. The 5 companies with Custer were still moving, and Benteen's exact position remained unknown. There was no time for a formal dispatch. Cook needed only enough paper for a few lines. A hand would steady it against whatever firm surface could be found. A pencil would press hurried words into the page. The great village below, the absent battalion, and the slow ammunition mules behind would all be reduced to a short order that one man could carry. And in that moment, the immense battlefield began to narrow into 6 lines of handwriting. Near the head of Medicine Tail Coulee, Lieutenant William Weir Cook took an ordinary piece of paper and tried to compress a changing battlefield into a handful of words. There was no quiet desk before him. No ink bottle stood beside a ledger. Horses shifted on the dry slope. Reins pulled gently against bits, and dust moved around the legs of men waiting for instructions. Somewhere below the bluffs, the Little Bighorn curved past cottonwoods, and the great encampment stretched along the valley. Cook had to write quickly. He steadied the paper against a firm surface, perhaps an order book, a saddle, or something close at hand, and pressed a pencil to it. The exact physical details of that brief act were not recorded by a survivor standing beside him, yet the handwriting itself preserves the haste. The letters are practical rather than elegant. The sentences are reduced to what seemed essential. The first word was a name, Benteen. There could be no uncertainty about the intended recipient. Captain Frederick Benteen was somewhere behind and southwest of the 5 companies, now traveling with Custer. His reconnaissance had carried him away from the main advance, and the first task of the message was to reach across that separation. A battlefield order often began with assumptions that did not need to be explained to the men involved. Cook did not write Benteen's rank, identify his battalion, or describe where he had last been seen. The messenger and the recipient already belonged to the same regiment. A single surname was enough. The next words were equally compact. "Come on." They sound almost conversational when read today. Yet in the setting of June 25th, they reversed the direction of an earlier command. Benteen had been sent outward to search. Now he was being called inward again. The note did not say, "Return to the main trail and wait." It did not ask for a report. It told him to come forward. That choice of wording suggests movement rather than consultation. Whatever Custer and Cook saw or believed they saw near the river, the time for Benteen's separate reconnaissance appeared to be over. His 3 companies were wanted closer to the developing action. Then Cook added the reason. Big village. Only 2 words. They did not provide a count of lodges or warriors. They did not describe how far the encampment extended or where its northern edge lay. But they gave Benteen the most important new information available to the writers of the message. The gathering was large. That phrase also carried an unspoken correction. The regiment had approached with incomplete knowledge. The trails had indicated many people and animals, but the country had concealed the full scale of the encampment. Now the officer receiving the note was being told that the situation ahead was more substantial than he may have understood when he rode southwest. Big village was not a battle plan. It was a warning. Cook then wrote, "Be quick." The message changed tone at that point. Benteen was not merely requested to return when convenient. Speed mattered. Yet those 2 words created a question the paper did not answer. How quick was quick enough? A mounted battalion could increase its pace, but the horses had already traveled through broken country. Men still needed to maintain formation and follow a route back toward the main advance. Benteen could hurry only from the place where the messenger found him, not from the place where Custer wished him to be. The instruction carried urgency, but not a clock. It also contained no exact destination. Custer's battalion was still moving. By the time Benteen received the order, the location from which it had been sent might already be empty. This was one of the central weaknesses of communication on the frontier battlefield. The written word could preserve an instruction, but it could not keep the sender still. Cook continued, "Bring packs." The phrase connected Benteen's return to the slow supply train somewhere behind him. The packs included the reserve ammunition carried on mules. They represented the regiment's ability to continue fighting after the cartridges already carried by individual soldiers had been used. They also included other supplies, but in this moment ammunition gave the instruction its sharpest importance. Custer apparently did not want only Benteen's mounted companies. He wanted the supporting resources behind them. But the order placed 2 different demands together. Benteen was to be quick, while also bringing forward animals that could not travel at the pace of lightly burdened cavalry horses. The contradiction was practical rather than careless. Custer needed men and ammunition. The battlefield did not offer the luxury of choosing only one. Cook reached the end of the main instruction, but then his pencil returned to the subject. P.S. Bring packs. He wrote it again. That repetition is the most revealing mark on the entire page. Perhaps Cook feared that Benteen might hurry forward with his own battalion and leave the supply column to follow at its usual pace. Perhaps Custer had emphasized the ammunition when giving the verbal command. Perhaps the adjutant simply understood that, among all the short phrases on the page, this one was too important to risk being overlooked. The note does not explain why the postscript was added. It only shows that Cook chose to add it. The repeated instruction gives the document a different texture. Without the postscript, the note might read as a straightforward call for reinforcement. With it, the order becomes partly a logistical appeal. Men were needed, but so were the boxes swaying on the sides of mules behind them. At the bottom, Cook signed his own name, W. W. Cook. The signature confirmed the written authority of the regimental adjutant. It also created a detail that later generations sometimes misunderstand. The paper is remembered as Custer's message because the command came from Custer and was sent on his behalf, but the hand was Cook's. How much of the exact phrasing came directly from Custer cannot be known with complete confidence. Custer may have spoken the essential wording nearly as it appears. Cook may have condensed a longer verbal instruction. He may have added the postscript himself to remove doubt. What survives is the adjutant's practical version of the order. The complete message read, "Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. W. Cook." It was not written as a farewell. Cook did not pause to describe the afternoon, record his emotions, or address anyone at home. There is no suggestion that he believed he was composing one of the most examined military documents in the history of the American West. He was completing a task. The power later attached to the note came from events Cook could not place on the page. The men who remained with him and Custer would not return to explain the command. Their voices would be absent from the later arguments. The few penciled lines would therefore be asked to answer questions for which they had never been designed. Did Custer expect immediate support? Clearly, yes. Did he know exactly how large the opposing force was? The note does not say. Was he already in desperate trouble? The urgency suggests concern, but the page provides no full tactical description. Could Benteen have reached him in time? No phrase on the paper can settle that question by itself. The document tells us what was requested at one moment. It cannot tell us everything that became possible or impossible afterward. Cook lifted the pencil. The order was complete. Around him, the physical world remained far larger than the message. The river lay below. The encampment continued beyond the visible bends. Reno was moving into a fight at the southern end. Benteen was returning through distant hills, and the pack train still labored somewhere to the rear. The paper had reduced all of that to a recipient, a warning, an instruction to hurry, and one request written twice. Now the words needed a rider. Among the soldiers near Custer was a young Italian-born trumpeter, whose command of English made written instructions especially useful. In a moment, Cook would place the page in his hands, and the message would leave the men who had created it. Cook's pencil stopped, and the meaning of the page changed at once. A moment earlier, it had been only writing. Now it needed a man. Giovanni Martini waited near the head of the column with the other mounted soldiers, his trumpet secured among the straps and equipment of his saddle. He was 23 years old, born in Italy in 1853, and still relatively new to the United States. Within the regiment, he was known by a name that would later become John Martin. On that afternoon, however, he was still the Italian-born trumpeter whose life was about to be redirected by a folded military order. Cook held the paper out to him. The exchange may have lasted only a few seconds. A gloved hand extended from one mounted man to another. Martini took the page and listened while Cook gave the spoken instructions that accompanied it. The horses did not become still for the occasion. One shifted its weight on the slope. Another shook its head against the bit. Dust moved past boots and stirrups while the column prepared to advance. No one paused to mark the moment. Yet the hand receiving the note belonged to a man whose earlier life had already trained him to carry signals through confusion. Martini had grown up in a Europe where armies still depended heavily on music for communication. As a youth, he had served as a drummer in the Italian military. A drum beat could regulate marching, announce duty, or carry a simple command farther than the human voice. The instrument did not explain a plan. It translated intention into a pattern that trained men recognized. After arriving in the United States in 1873, Martini enlisted in the American Army the following year. He eventually became a trumpeter in the 7th Cavalry. The trumpet served much the same practical purpose as the drum, though its voice traveled differently across open country. A few notes could call men to saddle, direct movement, announce a formation, or signal one of the routines around which cavalry life was organized. A trained soldier did not need a paragraph when a familiar call sounded. He heard the notes and acted. But on the bluffs above the Little Bighorn, Martini's trumpet could not reach the officer who needed the new instruction. Benteen was too far away. The terrain broke the country into hidden pockets. Even a clear call carried on the afternoon air would not identify the recipient, explain the large encampment, or tell him to bring the ammunition mules forward. This task required a rider. Trumpeters were sometimes used as orderlies or messengers because their work already placed them near officers and trained them to respond quickly to signals. They understood the movements of mounted commands. They were accustomed to watching for instructions and carrying them into action. Martini, therefore, was not selected at random from an anonymous line of soldiers. He belonged to a role built around communication. Still, sending him with a written note solved a particular problem. His English was limited, and his Italian accent was noticeable. That did not make him incapable of understanding or carrying out his duty. He had served in the regiment, followed military routines, and knew the men involved. But the command contained several separate ideas, and each one mattered. Find Benteen. Tell him the encampment is large. Tell him to hurry. Tell him to bring the packs. Then make certain he understands that last instruction. In the noise and motion of the afternoon, even a native English speaker might shorten the message, confuse the wording, or forget the postscript after a hard ride. Cook's handwriting removed much of that risk. Martini did not have to reproduce every phrase perfectly from memory. He needed to reach the right officer and place the document in his hand. The paper became a bridge between languages as well as between separated bodies of soldiers. Cook could speak rapidly. Martini could ride immediately. Benteen could read the instruction for himself. That practical arrangement is one reason the note survived in the form we know. It was not created because anyone expected Martini to fail. It was created because written words were more dependable than spoken ones under the circumstances. Martini secured the page where wind and sweat would not destroy it. The exact place has been described differently in later retellings, but the essential fact is clear. He protected it well enough to complete the delivery and preserve it afterward. Then he turned his mount. Behind Cook stood the men with whom Martini had been riding. The 5-company battalion was preparing to move farther along the heights above the river. Some soldiers may have barely noticed the trumpeter leave. Others may have understood that he was carrying a routine field order and expected him to rejoin the command later. Martini himself had no reason to treat the departure as permanent. A messenger usually rode away with the expectation that the men behind him would still exist as an organized command when his duty was finished. He might deliver the order, receive another instruction, and return. The task separated him temporarily from his assigned unit, not from his future. That assumption made the exchange ordinary. Its later meaning made it extraordinary. By accepting Cook's paper, Martini was removed from the men who would ride toward the northern ridges. The same command that asked him to summon help also carried him away from the place where that help was wanted. The assignment became an accidental path to survival. There was no sign of this in Cook's gesture. No farewell passed with the page. Custer did not select Martini because the young trumpeter needed to be spared. Cook did not send him away to preserve a witness. The regiment needed a messenger. Martini was available. That was enough. He gathered the reins, placed his horse in the direction of Benteen's returning companies, and began moving away from the column. The first strides may have been controlled as he crossed the uneven slope. Then, where the terrain allowed, the animal could lengthen its pace. The trumpet traveled with him, but it remained silent. Instead of carrying a musical call, Martini now carried Cook's pencil marks. The change suited the landscape. A trumpet note would fade after a few moments. The document could cross miles. Yet the rider still had to find a moving target. Benteen was not waiting at a marked station. His battalion had gone southwest and then turned back. Martini would need to follow the likely route, search the ridges, and recognize the approaching companies before passing them in the broken country. He also had to manage his horse. Speed mattered, but so did control. A stumble on loose earth could end the mission. A wrong turn into a coulee could cost minutes. An exhausted mount might leave him walking, with the order still undelivered. Martini, therefore, became part courier, part scout, and part keeper of the regiment's most urgent surviving instruction. As he descended from the position near Cook, the 5 companies behind him began to vanish from view. First, their lower bodies disappeared beyond the slope. Then the riders became silhouettes against the sky. At last, the earth closed between them. He had crossed no visible boundary, but his place in the story had changed. The men behind him were moving toward a battle from which they would leave no surviving officer to explain the message. The man riding away would live long enough to repeat his account, preserve the paper, and become known as the messenger who escaped the final movement of Custer's command. For now, he knew none of that. He knew only that Benteen had to be found. The note was secure. The route ahead was uncertain. Behind him, the sound of the column softened as the bluffs rose between them, and with every stride of Martini's horse, Cook's written order traveled farther from the men who had given it, and closer to the officer, who would have to decide what its urgent words required. Martini rode into the first fold of the land, and the men behind him disappeared. The change was immediate. From the higher slope, he had been surrounded by mounted soldiers, officers, guidons, and the low movement of Custer's 5 companies. A short descent placed a ridge between them. The column was no longer visible. Even the dust above it began to thin against the afternoon sky. Ahead lay a succession of dry rises, narrow coulées, and rounded hills. None was especially high. Together, they divided the battlefield into separate rooms. A rider could enter one of those rooms and lose sight of everything beyond it. Martini guided his horse down a sloping trace where loose earth shifted beneath the hooves. The animal shortened its stride. Its head lowered slightly as it searched for firm footing, and Martini allowed the reins enough freedom for it to choose a safe path. Speed mattered. A broken leg mattered more. At the bottom of the drainage, grass and brush rose near the horse's knees. The banks on either side blocked the wider view, leaving only a strip of pale sky overhead. Martini could not see the men he was seeking. He could not see the river. He could not see the 5 companies he had just left. He had only direction. Benteen's 3 companies had gone southwest and were believed to be returning toward the main trail, but they were not standing at a fixed meeting point. They were moving while Martini moved. The messenger was trying to intercept a body of riders whose position changed with every minute. This made the task more complicated than carrying a letter from one fort to another. A building remained where a map placed it. A battalion did not. Martini urged the horse upward. At the next crest, the surrounding country opened again. Sunlight lay across the grass. Dark seams marked the coulées. Farther away, a faint haze of dust hung near a ridge, but it was impossible to know what had raised it. It might be soldiers. It might be horses from the encampment. It might be the pack train, or it might be dust left behind after the riders themselves had already passed. Martini looked for shapes beneath it and found none he could identify. He continued. The trumpet at his side moved with the rhythm of the saddle. Leather straps rubbed softly against one another. The horse's breathing had grown deeper, and sweat gathered beneath the blanket and girth. The written instruction remained protected on Martini's person. It was the one part of the mission that did not change as he crossed the hills. The physical page stayed the same. The situation described by it did not. Behind him, Custer's battalion continued moving. Ahead, Benteen was returning from his search. Somewhere nearer the river, Reno's companies were approaching the southern end of the Lakota and northern Cheyenne encampment. The messenger rode between all 3 movements without being able to observe any of them clearly. A faint series of reports reached him across the warm air. Martini may have recognized the sound as gunfire, but sound alone offered little guidance. The reports came unevenly. A few seemed sharp. Others arrived softened by the ridges, as though the earth itself had absorbed part of them. He turned his head and listened. The direction was difficult to judge. Gunfire in open country could travel far, especially when the listener stood on high ground. Inside a coulee, the same sound might become faint or disappear. Wind could carry it from one side, while slopes reflected it from another. Hearing a fight did not tell Martini who was firing. It did not reveal how many men were involved. It did not show whether the action was growing or ending. Most importantly, it did not provide a safe route toward it. The written instruction told him to find Benteen, not to turn toward every distant report. Martini kept to his task. He descended again. The route narrowed beside a wash where exposed soil showed old hoof marks and newer disturbances. He slowed long enough to examine them. A few tracks pointed generally toward the line he expected Benteen to follow, but the dry earth preserved no clean sequence. Hooves from different groups had crossed and recrossed the area. Martini made a choice. He stayed with the broader trace rather than entering a smaller drainage that angled away to the left. The visible consequence came several minutes later. From another rise, he saw a longer stretch of disturbed grass leading toward the northeast. The returning battalion may have used that line. His decision had kept him near the most likely course. Still, no riders appeared. The landscape repeatedly offered hope and removed it. A dark line on one crest became a row of bushes. A moving shape resolved into a loose horse or distant animal. A column of dust faded before Martini reached the next hill. Each uncertainty cost attention, and every pause allowed the men he sought to travel farther. The horse could not maintain its fastest pace over such ground. On level stretches, Martini let it move freely. On steep descents, he gathered the reins. Where stones appeared through the soil, the animal placed its hooves with care. This was not the smooth gallop later paintings might suggest. It was a working ride across difficult country. There were moments of speed, followed by caution. Short climbs, sudden drops, brief stops to look, then movement again. The urgency of the note existed inside those limitations. Be quick did not flatten the hills. It did not strengthen a tiring animal. It could not make the destination stand still. Another cluster of reports came from beyond the eastern ridges. This time the firing seemed more sustained. Martini could hear individual shots joining into something broader, then breaking apart again. He looked back. Nothing of Custer's column remained visible. The ridge behind him was bare. For the first time, the young trumpeter may have understood how completely the ground had separated him from the men who sent him. If he turned back, he would have to search for them just as he was now searching for Benteen. Their route might already have carried them beyond another bluff or down another coulee. The paper in his keeping had become the only direct connection between the two commands. Martini rode on. The afternoon light sharpened the edges of the hills. Grasshoppers rose from the horse's path. Fine dust gathered on Martini's clothing and along the animal's damp neck. Then, near the top of a low ridge, he noticed movement ahead. Not dust alone, mounted figures. They appeared briefly against the skyline, vanished as the line descended, and then returned farther along the slope. There were too many to be a handful of scouts. The formation suggested organized troops, but Martini still had to make certain. The men might belong to the supply escort. They might be part of Reno's battalion. They might even be native riders crossing between the hills. Martini slowed near the crest and studied them. A guidon lifted above the moving line. The formation came into clearer view. 3 companies were returning from the southwest, their horses dark against the pale grass. The route and direction matched the men he had been sent to find. Benteen's battalion. Martini's search was nearly over, but the purpose of the ride was only beginning. The officer ahead still knew nothing of the immense encampment Custer had seen, nothing of Cook's repeated demand for the ammunition packs, and nothing of how much the battlefield had changed while the messenger crossed the ridges. Martini gathered the reins and turned his horse toward the approaching column, carrying the urgent page into the hands of the man whose judgment would now determine what its few lines meant. Martini approached the returning column from the front and slightly to one side, guiding his tired horse toward the officers near its head. The three companies had been moving at a measured pace after their unsuccessful search to the southwest. Their formation stretched along the dry trace between low ridges. Men sat heavily in their saddles. Dust clung to boots, trousers, and the damp coats of the animals beneath them. A few riders recognized the trumpeter as he came nearer. His presence carried information before he spoke. He belonged with the portion of the regiment that had gone forward. If he was now riding back alone, someone had sent him. The column slowed. Captain Frederick Benteen turned toward the approaching messenger. Martini brought his horse close enough to speak and reached for the protected page he had carried across the hills. Then the paper changed hands. For several moments, Benteen held Cook's writing while Martini waited beside him. The message was small enough to be read quickly, yet the situation it described required far more than a quick glance. Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. W. Cook. Benteen already knew one part of the story. He knew what lay southwest. Nothing. His three companies had examined the broken country and found no extension of the encampment, no large group leaving in that direction, and no second gathering hidden among the ridges. The mission that had taken him away from the main advance had produced a negative result. Now Cook's first important phrase gave him the information he had lacked. Big village. The words confirmed that the decisive activity lay elsewhere. While Benteen had been searching empty hills, the main command had found a gathering large enough for Custer to recall him. That alone justified a change in pace. Benteen could also hear, or may have been able to hear, scattered firing from the direction of the river. The sound was distant and irregular. It did not provide a clear account of what was happening, but it supported the urgency on the page. Be quick. That instruction was unmistakable. Benteen was not being asked to complete another sweep or return at an ordinary march. His companies were wanted forward. The reconnaissance had ended. He gave orders for the battalion to move with greater urgency. The visible change passed down the line. Riders gathered their reins. Horses that had been walking or moving at an easier pace were urged onward. The companies closed more firmly around their officers and followed the route leading back toward the regiment's line of advance. The note had altered their movement, but it had not made their destination entirely clear. Cook had written no coordinates. There was no sketch of the Bluffs, no marked crossing, and no indication of where Custer expected to be when Benteen arrived. Come on, pointed forward in a general sense, but Custer's 5 companies were themselves still traveling. Benteen had to move toward an officer whose position could not be fixed by the paper in his hand. The message also said nothing about Reno. Benteen did not know whether Reno's battalion had reached the valley, whether it had begun fighting, or whether it remained in position waiting for support. The page carried no warning that Reno might soon appear in retreat, bringing wounded men and disorder onto the route ahead. Nor did the message describe Custer's intended action. Was he preparing to descend toward the river? Was he continuing north to strike another part of the encampment? Was he waiting for Benteen and the ammunition before committing his 5 companies? Or had his circumstances already forced him to abandon the plan he held when Cook wrote the order? The note could not answer. This was the difference between urgency and clarity. Urgency tells a man that time matters. Clarity tells him where to go, what he will find, and what must be done when he arrives. Benteen had the first. He did not yet possess the second. Still, a field commander could not wait for perfect information. Benteen had been recalled. The encampment was large. Gunfire suggested that events were developing. His responsibility was to bring his companies forward while gathering whatever additional knowledge the route provided. The repeated instruction concerning the packs added another complication. The ammunition train remained behind the mounted battalion. It moved slowly, its mules burdened by boxes and equipment. Benteen could not both race ahead at the fastest possible pace and keep the entire train directly beside him. The wording did not explain how closely the two bodies were expected to travel together. Bring packs might mean find the train and personally escort it forward. It might mean pass the instruction back so the train would follow rapidly. It might mean make certain the supplies did not remain forgotten while the mounted companies moved toward the fighting. Benteen needed to interpret the practical intention rather than cling to only one literal method. Martini had delivered the message accurately. His central task was complete, yet he remained useful as a source of whatever he had observed before leaving Custer. The young trumpeter could identify where the order had been given in general terms and describe the route he had followed, but his knowledge also had limits. He had departed before the final movements of the 5 companies. Every statement he made described the command as it had been, not necessarily where it stood now. The farther he had ridden, the older his information had become. Benteen folded or secured the note. Around him, the battalion continued forward through the same ridges Martini had crossed alone. The messenger now rode among organized companies, rather than in isolation, but their greater numbers did not remove the terrain's difficulties. A company could not descend a narrow slope as one compact body. Horses still needed room. Men still had to watch their footing. Dust from the riders ahead reduced visibility for those behind. The order to hurry changed the effort, not the land. From each rise, officers looked for signs of the other commands. A distant dust cloud might indicate troops or movement from the encampment. Gunfire appeared and faded. No clear view of Custer emerged. Benteen therefore advanced toward information as much as toward a location. Every mile might reveal a courier, a wounded rider, a new order, or a visible line of soldiers. Until then, Cook's page remained the best guidance available. It contained only a few facts. The encampment was large. Custer wanted reinforcement. Speed was important. The ammunition reserve was needed. Everything else had to be discovered along the way. This is why the delivery cannot be treated as the end of Martini's ride or the simple beginning of obedience. The page did not arrive in a world waiting patiently for its instruction. It entered a battlefield already producing new demands. Benteen had been called toward Custer, but before he could reach the 5 companies, another part of the regiment would appear directly in his path. For the moment, however, the mounted column pressed forward, while somewhere behind it, the slowest and heaviest part of Cook's command still labored over the hills. The note had said to bring the packs. To understand what those repeated words required, we must leave the faster horses for a while and listen to the uneven pace of the mules carrying the regiment's reserve. Behind the faster riders, the regiment's reserve moved with a different rhythm. The pack train stretched across the hills in a long, uneven line. Approximately 175 mules carried ammunition, rations, medical supplies, tools, blankets, and equipment that could not be placed on the backs of already burdened cavalry horses. Lieutenant Edward Matthey managed the train, while Captain Thomas McDougall in Company B provided its principal escort. Other soldiers had been drawn from their regular companies to help with the enlarged column. Civilian packers worked among them. The result was not a neat single unit, but a mixed procession of mounted guards, handlers, burdened animals, loose ropes, wooden boxes, and canvas-wrapped loads. It carried the material strength of the 7th Cavalry. It also carried its slowness. One mule climbed a dry incline with 2 ammunition boxes swaying against its sides. The load had shifted slightly, pulling one box lower than the other. A packer noticed the imbalance and rode close, watching the animal's footing as it reached the crest. Then the mule stumbled. It recovered without falling, but the column behind it compressed at once. Reins tightened. Another animal turned sideways. A soldier dismounted while the packer reached for the ropes. The procession stopped. The wooden boxes had to be lifted, balanced, and secured again. A loose load could rub the mule raw, pull it from the trail, or drag the animal down on the next steep descent. Hurrying without making the repair might save a minute and lose the ammunition entirely. Hands pulled the lash ropes tight. The boxes rose into place. The mule moved again. The delay was small, repeated across scores of animals. Such delays shaped the speed of the whole train. This was why the words "bring packs" carried more weight than they first appeared to hold. The packs could not simply be ordered forward like 3 companies of mounted soldiers. They had to be gathered, managed, protected, and physically moved through country that punished haste. A cavalryman carried much of what he needed immediately on or around his saddle. His carbine ammunition, revolver cartridges, canteen, blanket, and personal equipment traveled with him. But a regiment could not place every reserve cartridge, medical item, ration, and tool on the fighting mounts without exhausting them before battle began. The mules solved that problem. They were strong, economical pack animals, able to carry loads across rough country where wagons might fail. They required less refined feed than many horses, and could continue through difficult terrain with surprising endurance. Yet they did not behave like machines. Some followed calmly. Others resisted narrow crossings, crowded one another, or attempted to leave the line. A mule startled by noise might twist beneath its load. Another might stop on a steep grade and refuse the pressure of the rope behind it. Packers had to understand the animals individually. A shouted command was often less useful than approaching the correct side, adjusting a lead rope, or giving the mule a moment to find its footing. The train therefore advanced through constant small decisions. Which side of a wash offered firmer ground? Should a slipping load be repaired immediately or carried to the next level place? Could a straggling animal be brought forward without stopping the entire column? How widely should the escort spread when the hills concealed what lay nearby? Matthey and McDougall were not merely following at the rear. They were trying to preserve a moving supply system while the combat battalions widened the space ahead of them. The ammunition boxes gave that system its greatest urgency. Each box contained cartridges that might become essential if the fighting lasted longer than the supply carried by individual men. But cartridges inside a wooden container on a mule were not yet ammunition in a soldier's hand. The animal had to arrive. The box had to be found among the loads. The lid had to be opened. The cartridges had to be distributed to the companies that needed them. Every step required time. This created the quiet logistical problem inside Cook's repeated instruction. To bring the ammunition forward, someone had to remain close enough to guide and protect it. To be quick, mounted soldiers needed freedom to move faster than the train. The 2 demands pulled in opposite directions. If Benteen waited for every mule to close the gap, his battalion could lose valuable time. If he pushed ahead and left the train unsupported, the supplies might arrive late, scattered, or vulnerable. The message did not explain how to balance those risks. It could not. That balance depended on the terrain and on what Benteen encountered before reaching the sender. For the men with the train, the wider battle remained largely invisible. They could see dust on distant heights. They could sometimes hear firing, softened by the folds of the land. But the sounds did not identify which battalion was engaged or how urgently ammunition was needed. The column continued northeast. A lead animal entered a narrow drainage. Mules followed one by one, their loads brushing grass and low growth along the sides. The front of the train began climbing the opposite slope while the rear remained out of sight below. From the crest, the procession seemed to have no end. A soldier looking back could see animals emerging from the ravine, each carrying a portion of the regiment's supplies. Looking forward, he could see only the next rise and the dust of men who had gone ahead. The pack train occupied the space between intention and arrival. At headquarters, reserve ammunition might be discussed as a number of boxes or rounds. Here, it had weight. It pressed against pack saddles. It shifted downhill. It required rope, muscle, patience, and animals that did not understand why the men around them had suddenly become more urgent. The order to move faster passed backward through the column. Packers urged the animals onward where the path allowed. The escort watched the slopes more closely. Men who had dismounted for repairs climbed back into their saddles and followed. The pace increased, but only slightly. A mule carrying ammunition could not become a cavalry horse because someone had written, "Be quick," on a page. That was the deeper meaning of the postscript. Custer wanted the reserve brought forward, but asking for it meant asking for the slow heart of the regiment. The packs were essential precisely because they carried what the faster bodies could not carry for themselves. Their weakness was not uselessness. Their weakness was time. As the train worked over another ridge, firing from the direction of the river became more noticeable. Some men turned their heads toward it. Others continued watching the animals, because a loose diamond hitch or straying mule still demanded immediate attention, even when a battle could be heard beyond the hills. Then, mounted figures appeared farther ahead. At first, they seemed like another organized body returning along the line of advance. As the range closed, the scene became less orderly. Riderless animals moved among men. Small groups appeared separated from one another. Some riders leaned awkwardly in their saddles. Others looked backward toward the valley. The situation in front of the pack train was no longer merely distant sound. Something had happened to Reno's battalion. The reserve ammunition Cook wanted, carried toward Custer, was approaching soldiers who had already been in a severe fight. Before the mules could be directed farther north, the men around them would have to understand why Reno's command was coming up from the river in such a changed condition. The first clear sign of Reno's trouble was not a report carried by an orderly. It was the shape of his command coming up from the river. Men appeared along the bluff in scattered groups rather than a single formed line. Some still rode with their companies. Others came up beside soldiers from different units. Riderless horses moved among them, reins swinging beneath their necks, while officers tried to collect men who had crossed the Little Bighorn by different paths. To understand how they reached that high ground, we must follow Reno's battalion through the valley below. Major Marcus Reno had advanced toward the southern end of the encampment with 3 companies. At first, his men approached on horseback through open country, with the river and cottonwood timber ahead. The broad valley gave them more room than the narrow ridges above, but it also exposed the scale of the gathering they were nearing. Lodges continued far beyond the first visible camp. Horse herds moved across the bottoms. Riders began coming out to meet the soldiers. Reno's battalion was not approaching a few families surprised beside the water. It was moving toward a community already receiving warnings and rapidly preparing to resist. The cavalry continued forward for a time, then halted and dismounted. One man in every group remained behind to control several horses, while the others formed a skirmish line. That method provided steadier fire and made the soldiers less vulnerable to losing control of frightened mounts. It also reduced the number of carbines immediately available on the line. The men spread across the valley floor. Grass brushed against their boots. Smoke and dust partly concealed the lodge circles ahead. The Little Bighorn lay nearby, bordered by cottonwoods and thick growth that offered both cover and uncertainty. Reno's soldiers began firing from the dismounted line. The response grew. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors crossed the valley, using the open ground, river bends, and vegetation with confidence. Their numbers became increasingly difficult for Reno's men to judge. Individual riders appeared, vanished behind dust, and returned from another direction. What began as an advance toward the encampment became a position that had to be defended. Reno ordered a withdrawal toward the timber near the river. The trees offered shade, concealment, and a temporary barrier against mounted movement. Soldiers led or rode their horses into the wooded area, and attempted to reorganize. The change from open skirmish line to timber created a momentary shelter, but it did not restore a clear picture of the battle. The vegetation restricted sight. Men heard firing without always seeing its source. Horses shifted among trunks and brush. Those holding several animals struggled to keep them together, while other soldiers looked for a place from which to return fire. Some accounts suggest that the timber position might have been held longer. Others emphasize the growing pressure, confusion, and danger of remaining close to the encampment with no visible support. Whatever Reno's full reasoning, he decided to leave. The retreat from the timber was far less orderly than the approach. Men mounted quickly. Some horses were difficult to find. Others had broken loose or been struck. Soldiers who had been spread through the trees now attempted to form around officers, calling them toward the river. The command moved out. The Little Bighorn was not a broad, quiet road. Its banks varied, and the water concealed uneven footing. Horses entered at different places. Some found manageable crossings. Others stumbled or struggled up the opposite side. The battalion did not pass through as one clean body. Small groups crossed together. Individuals became separated. Wounded men needed help. Those already on the eastern bank looked back and saw companions still trying to reach the water. Beyond them, native warriors pressed the retreat. The river crossing changed the shape of Reno's command. Companies that had entered the valley in recognizable formation emerged as a mixture of survivors moving toward the steep bluffs. The climb was exhausting. Horses that had already carried men through the approach, skirmish, timber, and river now faced the rising ground above the eastern bank. Loose soil shifted beneath their hooves. Riders leaned forward to help the animals balance. Men on foot grasped stirrups, reins, or whatever support they could find. The high ground promised relief because it offered distance from the river bottom and a wider field of view. But reaching it did not end the disorder. At the top, officers attempted to count men and reform their units. The visible losses were immediate. Familiar faces were missing. Some soldiers had been left in the timber or separated during the crossing. Others would arrive later after hiding or finding different routes. Riderless animals wandered through the gathering. A carbine hung from one empty saddle. A canteen swung against another. One horse stood trembling, its reins trailing in the dust until a soldier caught them and led it aside. The objects told part of the story before anyone produced a full report. Reno's battalion had not simply changed position. It had been badly shaken. That was the scene Benteen's 3 companies approached from the southeast. His men had also ridden hard, but they still arrived in comparatively organized formation. Company guidons remained visible. Officers retained control of their groups. The horses were tired, yet the battalion had not passed through the violent confusion of the valley retreat. Fresh order met recent disorder on the bluff. Men from Reno's command looked toward the arriving companies with relief. Here were soldiers who had not been scattered, men who could strengthen the position and perhaps explain where the rest of the regiment had gone. Benteen, however, brought his own unanswered question. Cook's page directed him onward. "Come on, be quick." The instruction pointed toward Custer, somewhere farther north. But the scene directly before Benteen carried another kind of command. Wounded soldiers needed protection. Separated companies needed time to reform. The high ground had to be held until the pack train arrived. Reno's men did not know where Custer was. Some may have expected him to appear nearby. Others listened for firing beyond the ridges and wondered whether the 5 companies were already engaged. No one on the bluff possessed a complete map of events. Reno had seen only the southern fighting. Benteen had seen only empty country, and Martini's short message. Martini knew where he had left Custer, but not where the 5 companies had moved afterward. The pieces of the regiment were finally beginning to meet again, yet their information did not join as easily as their bodies. Benteen could read Cook's instruction. He could also read the physical evidence before him. The shaken horses, the missing men, the wounded being helped from saddles, the officers trying to restore order. A written command carried authority, but an immediate emergency carried weight of its own. For the first time, the note no longer seemed like a simple direction along a route. It had become one demand among several, and the demands pointed in different directions. Farther north, Custer expected reinforcement. On the bluff, Reno's survivors needed it already. Benteen had reached the moment when obeying the words was no longer only a matter of moving faster. He now had to decide what those words required in a situation Cook had never seen. Benteen remained mounted for a moment near the edge of the gathering, facing north while Reno's men collected themselves around his 3 companies. The trail ahead continued over the bluffs toward the unseen position of Custer's command. Behind and below, the Little Bighorn curved through the valley. Around Benteen, wounded soldiers were being helped from saddles, riderless horses were caught, and officers tried to restore recognizable company groups from the scattered men who had reached the heights. 2 demands now stood before him. One was written, the other was visible. Cook's note told him to come forward quickly. Reno's condition showed what could happen to a battalion that remained unsupported near the encampment. Major Reno was the senior officer present. He had entered the valley with 3 companies and returned with his force badly reduced and disorganized. Some men were missing. Others remained separated near the river or timber. The survivors who had reached the bluff were exhausted and uncertain whether Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors would press the attack onto the high ground. Reno urged Benteen to stay. Later accounts preserved the substance of that appeal more clearly than every exact word. Reno reportedly told him that he had lost half his men and needed support. The statement may not have been a precise count. In that moment, Reno could not yet know the exact fate of every absent soldier. Some had been killed, some were wounded, some were hiding or making their way toward the bluff by other routes. What mattered was the condition he could see. His battalion had suffered heavily. Benteen looked north. The terrain revealed no line of Custer's soldiers. He could hear firing at times, but the sound did not show where the 5 companies stood or what route would reach them. Cook's paper contained no updated position. Martini could say where he had left the command, yet that place might already be behind Custer's movement. Reno Hill offered a problem that could be touched. Custer's situation remained hidden. In later years, this pause would become one of the most argued moments in the history of the Little Bighorn. From a quiet room, with maps open and the outcome already known, the choice can appear almost simple. Custer had sent an order. Benteen should have followed it immediately. Every minute mattered. According to this interpretation, stopping with Reno reduced the chance that the 3 fresh companies might reach the northern battlefield, while assistance could still make a difference. The command "be quick" allowed little room for delay. Benteen knew the encampment was large, knew firing could be heard, and knew his superior officer had called him forward. The criticism has force because the instruction was direct, but the view from the bluff was not the view from a later map. Benteen did not know that Custer's 5 companies would all be lost. He did not know how long their final position would hold. He did not know whether Custer had moved farther north, descended toward the river, or changed direction entirely. He did know that Reno's damaged battalion stood directly before him. To ride past those men would not have been a neutral act. It would have removed the most organized force available from a position where the survivors might soon face renewed pressure. Reno still held senior rank among the officers on the hill. Benteen could not simply treat him as an obstacle beside the route. The 2 battalions belonged to the same regiment, and their reunion created responsibilities not described in Cook's earlier message. This forms the second interpretation. Benteen had received an order based on one battlefield situation and arrived in another. The note assumed that he could move toward Custer while bringing the packs. It did not account for Reno's retreat, wounded men, scattered companies, or the possibility that the high ground itself might need to be defended. Under this view, remaining was not defiance. It was adaptation. A responsible officer had to interpret an instruction in light of what had changed since it was written. Benteen's companies began to provide the order Reno's survivors lacked. Officers placed men where they could watch the approaches. Soldiers gathered loose horses. Wounded men were moved into what little shelter the uneven ground provided. Ammunition was checked, while riders looked for the approaching pack train. The changed situation became visible almost at once. Men who had reached the bluff in small, shaken groups now had formed companies beside them. Reno's position was no longer held only by survivors of the valley retreat. Benteen's arrival gave it a stable core. That did not answer the question of Custer. It only made the decision harder. A third interpretation begins with the limits of the question itself. What if there was no single moment when Benteen could simply choose between saving Reno and saving Custer? The timing of the northern fight remains uncertain in important details. The exact sequence of Custer's movements cannot be reconstructed minute by minute with complete confidence. Martini's ride required time. Benteen's return from the southwest required time. Reaching Reno Hill required time. Moving from there toward Custer required still more. Even if Benteen had passed the bluff without stopping, he would have needed to locate the 5 companies across ridges and coulées while warriors moved through the same country. The issue may therefore be larger than personal obedience. A delayed message, a moving sender, a tired battalion, and broken terrain may already have made timely reinforcement impossible before Benteen understood that Custer required it. This possibility does not prove that every decision was correct. It warns against pretending that one decision explains everything. Benteen did remain with Reno for a time. The companies combined. The pack train drew nearer. Men attempted to understand the firing to the north and the movement visible near the river. The pause was not completely passive. Officers listened. Riders watched the ridges. Reports passed between survivors. Men searched the northern horizon for dust or guidons that might reveal Custer's position. Captain Thomas Weir, commanding Company D, was especially troubled by the distant firing. He had served closely with Custer and believed the sounds might come from the 5-company battalion. The longer the combined force remained on the bluff, the more urgent his concern became. Benteen, meanwhile, had to balance what he had been ordered to do with what he now commanded in practice. If he moved north with his own companies, would Reno's men follow? Could the wounded be left? Should the column wait for the reserve ammunition specifically requested in the note? Would advancing across exposed high ground bring the regiment together, or place another battalion in danger without finding Custer at all? No answer came from the empty ridge ahead. Cook's message had crossed the battlefield successfully, but its authority now depended on interpretation. The words remained unchanged. Their practical meaning had shifted. "Come on" no longer meant only ride back from reconnaissance. It now meant decide what could be left behind. Be quick no longer meant only increase the pace. It meant act before incomplete information became useless. And bring packs meant that the force being called forward was still waiting for the slow ammunition train to reach the hill. Benteen looked north while Reno's survivors gathered around his men. Somewhere beyond the rolling heights, the firing continued in uneven bursts. The written order could not show its source, but the sound might, and soon one officer would decide that waiting on the bluff was no longer enough. The men on Reno Hill began listening before they understood what they were listening for. For a few moments, the ordinary sounds of the position seemed to recede. Horses breathed beside loosened reins. A wounded man shifted on the dry earth. Somewhere among the gathered animals, a metal cup struck softly against a saddle. Then came a distant series of rifle reports. Several soldiers turned their heads north. The firing was faint, but it was not imagined. A few shots arrived separately, followed by a tighter concentration that seemed to roll across the high country beyond the visible ridge. Then the sound weakened again. An officer stepped away from the horses and raised a hand for quiet. Men stood still. Nothing could be seen in the direction of the reports. The nearest rise blocked the northern landscape. No line of blue uniforms appeared on its crest. No guidon lifted above the grass. Smoke from the firing, if there was enough to see, remained concealed by the folds of the bluffs. Only the sound crossed over. Some of the officers believed it came from Custer's 5 companies. That was the most natural conclusion. Reno had already fought in the valley. Benteen had heard the encampment described as large. Custer had continued north along the heights. Firing from that direction seemed to fit the incomplete picture. Yet certainty remained impossible. The Little Bighorn battlefield did not carry sound evenly. A rifle fired from one ridge could seem surprisingly close to a listener on another. A group firing from within a coulee might sound distant or disappear entirely. Wind moved through the valley and over the bluffs, strengthening some reports while carrying others away. The same shots could reach 2 men differently, depending on where they stood. One officer might hear a sustained engagement. Another, a few paces lower on the slope, might hear only scattered fire. A soldier beside restless horses heard bits of conversation, metal equipment, and animals shifting around him. A man standing alone near the crest heard more of the northern reports, but could not measure their distance. Sound provided warning without explanation. It did not say whether Custer was advancing or defending. It did not reveal whether the firing came from 5 companies together or from smaller groups already separated. It could not show whether help was still possible. Later testimony would differ over exactly when the volleys were heard, how heavy they seemed, and which officers recognized their importance. Such differences are not surprising. Memories formed under uncertainty rarely align into a perfect clock. On Reno Hill, the men were not listening for history. They were trying to decide whether the sound required immediate movement. Captain Thomas Weir believed that it did. Weir commanded Company D, one of the 3 companies that had returned with Benteen. He had served closely with Custer and was deeply concerned by the firing beyond the ridge. Where others heard an uncertain signal, Weir heard a reason to go north. He looked along the route ahead. The track rose and fell over exposed high ground before reaching the next prominent elevation. Whatever lay beyond could not be learned from the present position. Someone would have to ride closer. Weir sought permission to advance. The surviving accounts do not produce a perfectly simple exchange between every officer involved. What is clear is that Weir became increasingly unwilling to remain where he was, while firing continued in the direction Custer had taken. The paper carried by Martini had said, "Come on." Now the gunfire seemed to repeat the instruction without words. But sound could not replace command. The combined force still contained wounded men, tired animals, and companies only partly reorganized after Reno's retreat. The ammunition train was coming forward. Native riders could be seen in different parts of the valley and high ground. Moving one company north might expose it before the rest were ready to follow. Waiting carried risk. Advancing carried another. The officers watched the northern ridge as another burst of firing reached them. This time, several men counted the reports almost without intending to. The shots came rapidly enough to suggest more than an isolated exchange. Then they faded, leaving only wind across the grass. The absence after the firing was more troubling than the sound itself. Had the action moved farther away? Had the men stopped firing because their position had changed? Or had the ridge simply swallowed the noise? No answer appeared. Weir made his choice. Company D prepared to move. Soldiers gathered their reins and climbed into saddles if they had dismounted. A guidon was brought forward. Men checked carbines, adjusted equipment, and turned their mounts toward the northern route. The change was visible across the position. A company that had been standing among the combined force now formed into a moving column. Some men from Reno's battalion watched them with uncertainty. Others appeared relieved that someone was finally going toward the distant firing. Officers exchanged brief words. The decision by one commander began creating pressure on the others. If Weir moved alone, his company might become isolated. If the rest followed, Wounded men and the newly arrived supplies would have to be brought with them or protected behind. The movement therefore became more than one officer's impatience. It changed the choices available to everyone on the hill. Weir led Company D north. The riders passed over the dry ground in a controlled advance, not a wild charge. Horses climbed the first rise and disappeared gradually from view, just as Martini and Custer's battalion had disappeared earlier behind other folds in the land. Once again, the terrain separated men who were trying to support one another. The guidon remained visible for a few moments above the crest. Then it vanished. Other elements began preparing to follow. The combined command could not allow Company D to travel indefinitely without support. Benteen's remaining companies, men from Reno's battalion, and the approaching pack train would be drawn northward in stages. The firing had achieved what the written order alone had not. It produced movement, yet it still had not produced knowledge. Weir did not know what he would find beyond the next elevation. He might see Custer's companies in formation. He might find only dust and distant riders. He might discover a route forward, or learn that the high ground exposed his men to a force already turning south. The company crossed another shallow depression. Men leaned forward as their horses climbed. On the higher ground ahead, the valley opened in fragments between ridges. Dust rose in the distance. At first, it could not be connected to any particular body of men. Weir continued toward the prominent rise that would later bear his name. Behind him, more soldiers followed, carrying wounded companions, supplies, and the uncertainty of Reno Hill. Ahead, the rifle reports became less distinct, even as the riders moved closer to the place from which they believed the sounds had come. That was the strange cruelty of the landscape. A man could ride toward a battle and hear less of it. He could reach higher ground and still fail to see the people he hoped to find. By the time Weir approached the northern overlook, the question was no longer whether the command would respond to Cook's note. They were moving now. The question was what remained to be reached when they arrived at the next ridge. Weir's riders climbed toward the high promontory, one company at a time. The rise stood roughly a mile or more north of Reno Hill, depending on the route taken across the broken bluffs. It was close enough to appear reachable, yet far enough for every shallow depression and steep slope between the two positions to slow the movement. Company D reached the higher ground first. The horses came over the crest, breathing hard. Men leaned forward in their saddles, then straightened as the northern country opened before them. Captain Thomas Weir moved to a point where he could look beyond the immediate ridges toward the place later known as Last Stand Hill. Other officers joined him. For a moment, several mounted men stood against the sky, searching through a veil of dust. The elevation gave them a wider view than Reno Hill, but not a clear one. To the west, the Little Bighorn and parts of the immense encampment could be seen through breaks in the terrain. Northward, low ridges continued toward Custer's probable battlefield. Dust clouds drifted above them. Smoke appeared in faint patches and then dissolved into the afternoon light. Movement was everywhere. Meaning was not. One officer raised field glasses and held them steady. Through the lenses, distant figures crossed a slope and disappeared. Another group emerged from behind a ridge farther south. Horses moved in clusters across open ground, but the distance made uniforms, weapons, and intentions difficult to distinguish. No organized line of Custer's soldiers appeared. No messenger rode out from the northern heights. No guidon marked the location of the 5 companies. The men at Weir Point could see signs of a major action without seeing the command they had come to support. Behind Company D, more elements of the 7th Cavalry worked their way north. Benteen's remaining companies followed. Men from Reno's battalion moved with them in less orderly groups. The pack train and wounded could not travel at the pace of the first riders, so the combined force stretched across the route. The high promontory was not an empty observation platform. It began to fill with horses, mules, soldiers, and equipment. Some riders dismounted to rest their animals and gain a steadier view. Others remained in the saddle because the situation did not feel secure enough for a long halt. Wounded men were helped along. Packers urged the burdened mules over inclines that the cavalry horses had crossed more easily. The effort of bringing the whole command forward revealed another limit of Cook's instruction. A message could tell Benteen to come on, could not make every part of the regiment arrive together. The fastest company stood on Weir Point, while the slowest supplies were still behind. Between them stretched a thin and vulnerable line. Weir continued looking north. The rifle reports that had drawn him forward were now less distinct. At times, the firing seemed to have stopped. At other moments, a scattered cluster of shots drifted across the ridges. The reduced sound did not bring reassurance. It suggested that the action had changed. Dust rose heavily near the northern battlefield. Within it, mounted groups began moving southward. At first, the officers could not tell whether these were soldiers withdrawing from Custer, native warriors repositioning, or loose horses driven by the confusion. As the movement came nearer, its scale became clearer. Large numbers of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors were riding from the direction of Custer's position. Some moved along the ridges. Others crossed lower ground and coulees, using routes hidden from direct observation until they emerged closer to Weir Point. Their appearance suggested not a small patrol, but a powerful force turning its attention southward. The scene changed. Until then, the officers had been trying to find a path toward Custer. Now they had to consider whether the path behind them would remain open. Weir Point offered broad observation, but it was not naturally suited for a long defense by a command burdened with wounded men and a large pack train. The high ground was exposed. The force was stretched out. Separate companies had arrived at different times and occupied positions that had not been carefully prepared. A line of warriors appeared on one flank. Another group moved through lower ground where dust concealed its full size. Soldiers near the crest shifted their horses and watched the approaches. Carbines were brought into easier reach. Officers called companies closer together. The visible consequence of reaching the overlook was not contact with Custer. It was the realization that the surviving command might itself be cut off. This was the geographical climax of the failed reunion. From Reno Hill, Custer had been hidden by the northern ridges. At Weir Point, the men could look farther, but the greater view did not create a usable route. The land between the commands was not simply empty space waiting to be crossed. It contained slopes, ravines, dust, and a rapidly increasing number of warriors moving south. The words "come on" had finally carried men to the closest important elevation. Still, the 5 companies remained unreachable. It is tempting to imagine that 1 more mile would have solved the problem. On a map, the positions seem close. A finger can move from Weir Point toward Last Stand Hill in a second. Mounted men could not. They would have had to descend from the promontory, cross exposed terrain, pass through coulees they could not fully observe, and advance against warriors arriving from the northern fight. They would have needed to protect their flanks, maintain contact with the rest of the command, and somehow bring ammunition and wounded men through the same space. Even then, they did not know where a surviving line of Custer's soldiers could be found. No clear defensive position appeared through the dust. No signal answered them. The chance to join the Northern Battalion, if such a chance had remained when Martini delivered the note, was now vanishing before their eyes. Weir's concern had brought the command closer. It had not brought it in time. The movement of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors became more direct. Riders approached the high ground in numbers that threatened to surround the exposed position. Firing increased around the edges of the cavalry force. An officer called for the companies to prepare to fall back. The decision was not made because the need to reach Custer had disappeared. It was made because pressing farther could destroy the remaining 7 companies without finding him. Men turned their horses south. The pack animals had to be redirected. Wounded soldiers needed help. Companies that had arrived in sequence now had to withdraw without allowing the movement to become another scattered retreat. The high promontory that had promised an answer offered only danger and dust. Company D began leaving the exposed ground. Other units followed. Soldiers watched the northern approaches while the column worked back toward the stronger position on Reno Hill. The withdrawal was controlled, but it carried a heavy recognition. They had moved toward the firing. They had climbed high enough to see the northern battlefield. They had found no Custer. Behind them, warriors occupied more of the ground the cavalry had just abandoned. Ahead, Reno Hill offered a place where the combined command could gather, distribute ammunition, and prepare to defend itself. Cook's message had asked that the packs be carried forward toward Custer. Now those same packs were moving back with the survivors. Their destination had changed, and when the ammunition boxes were finally opened, they would serve not the 5 companies named only indirectly in the note, but the men who had reached the Bluffs and still had a position left to hold. The pack train entered Reno Hill as the withdrawing companies settled back into the shallow depression. Mules crowded together beneath drifting dust, their ears turned toward rifle fire along the surrounding heights. Wooden boxes knocked gently against pack saddles, and loose straps moved against canvas bundles as handlers guided the animals into the most protected ground they could find. The supplies had arrived, but not where Cook had expected them to go. When the repeated words "bring packs" were written near Medicine Tail Coulee, the ammunition was being summoned toward Custer's 5 companies. Now those same boxes were surrounded by Reno's exhausted survivors, Benteen's returning battalion, Company B, civilian packers, and the men who had fallen back from Weir Point. The purpose of the train changed without anyone rewriting the order. A soldier moved to the side of one mule and loosened the diamond hitch holding its load. Another man steadied the animal by the bridle. The rope slackened, and a wooden ammunition box was lowered into the dust. The lid was forced open. Inside were cartridges packed for distribution. Men gathered quickly, bringing empty or partly used belts, cartridge loops, and containers from different companies. The ammunition had to be divided where it was most urgently required. No single officer could simply announce that every man had enough. Someone had to open each box, identify its contents, and place the cartridges into waiting hands. The work was practical and immediate. A man counted rounds. Another carried a supply toward a company posted on the perimeter. An officer redirected him toward a more exposed section where firing had increased. The boxes that had swayed slowly over the hills now became fixed points inside a defensive position. Around them, the combined command took shape. The area known today as the Reno-Benteen Defense Site was not a fortified camp waiting to receive soldiers. It was uneven high ground selected under pressure. Shallow depressions offered limited shelter. Ridges and slopes surrounded the position. Parts of the perimeter could be approached without remaining continuously visible. The soldiers had to turn that imperfect place into something they could hold. Companies were assigned along the edges. Horses and mules were drawn into the interior as much as possible. Wounded men were placed where the ground offered protection. Carbines were loaded, ammunition checked, and fields of fire examined. Benteen moved through the position with a different responsibility than the one he had carried during the ride back from his reconnaissance. Earlier, his task had been to find what lay southwest. Then it had been to answer Cook's summons. Now it was to help organize the survival of the men who had gathered on the bluff. He directed companies toward threatened portions of the perimeter and helped restore movement where confusion remained. Soldiers from Reno's battalion, who had arrived in scattered groups, now stood beside men from Benteen's companies and the pack train escort. The separate bodies of the 7th Cavalry had joined. Custer's 5 companies were the only major part still absent. The arrival of Company B under Captain McDougal added both men and structure. The escort that had protected the mules now became part of the defensive line. Packers who had spent the day watching loads and animals found themselves inside a position under fire. Lieutenant Edward Matthey continued managing the crowded train. The mules could not be left to scatter. Frightened animals might break through a line of soldiers, carry ammunition away, or create confusion at the worst possible moment. Men held reins, adjusted ropes, and moved the animals into lower ground. The effort created a strange center to the position. Inside the defensive perimeter stood a dense gathering of tired horses and burdened mules. Around them lay open boxes, discarded lash ropes, saddles, blankets, and equipment. Beyond them, companies faced outward toward the ridges. The supplies had become part of the fortification. A wooden box could provide a small amount of cover. A pack saddle could be placed beside a shallow scrape. Animals and equipment marked the interior space that the soldiers were trying to protect. The irony was quiet but complete. Custer had asked for ammunition to be moved toward him. The ammunition had come forward. Yet by the time it reached organized troops, those troops were defending Reno Hill, rather than advancing toward Last Stand Hill. This did not mean the request had been meaningless. The packs were urgently needed. They simply served the portion of the regiment that remained able to receive them. Without the reserve cartridges, the combined force would have faced a much more dangerous defense. The soldiers had already fired during Reno's Valley fight, the retreat, the advance toward Weir Point, and the movement back to the hill. Ammunition carried by individual men was not unlimited. The open boxes extended their ability to resist. They also allowed officers to think beyond the next few minutes. A company could be reinforced. A threatened section could continue firing. Men could be sent to protect a water detail, with some confidence that cartridges remained behind. The packs changed the defensive position from a temporary gathering into a force capable of enduring. Benteen became especially active wherever pressure increased. His later reputation would remain tied to the unanswered question of whether he should have moved toward Custer sooner. Yet on Reno Hill, his conduct took a clearer form. He helped place men where they were needed. He encouraged active resistance rather than passive waiting. When a portion of the line appeared weak, he helped strengthen it. When water became a serious concern, men sent toward the river required covering fire and protection. When native warriors pressed closer to parts of the position, companies had to respond before the pressure spread. The same officer criticized for failing to reach one battlefield became an important reason the second battlefield did not collapse. Both judgments can exist together. One does not erase the other. The combined command numbered roughly 350 men who would survive at the Reno-Benteen position. They included soldiers who had crossed the river with Reno, men who had returned from Benteen's reconnaissance, Company B, members of the pack train detail, scouts, and civilian personnel. Their survival was not guaranteed by reaching the hill. They still faced repeated pressure through the remainder of June 25th and much of June 26. Water was distant. The wounded needed care. The position had little prepared shelter, and no one yet knew when another army column might arrive. But the train had brought what the defense required most: time in the form of ammunition in the form of heavy boxes carried by animals that had seemed painfully slow while the combat companies moved ahead. Now that slowness no longer looked like failure. It looked like the cost of bringing the materials without which the hill could not be held. Another box was opened. Cartridges passed from hand to hand. A soldier filled the loops of his belt, closed the flap of a pouch, and moved back toward his company's position. Behind him, a packer retightened a rope around supplies that had not yet been unloaded. The defensive circle became more organized with every small action. Cook's postscript had reached its practical conclusion, though not the conclusion he intended. The packs were present. Their ammunition was in use. Their escort had joined the line, and the soldiers around them were preparing not to ride farther north, but to remain where they stood. As the afternoon weakened and the light began its slow descent, the open boxes, crowded animals, and shallow rifle positions formed the center of a new and longer struggle. Custer's whereabouts were still unknown. The firing to the north had faded. Night would come before the men on Reno Hill understood what had happened beyond the ridges, and they would spend it holding the supplies that had arrived too late for one command, but in time for another. As the light faded over Reno Hill, The men began digging into the earth. Some used bayonets. Others worked with tin cups, knives, plates, or whatever firm object could loosen the dry soil. The shallow scrapes they made were not true trenches. A few inches of earth, raised before a man's chest, might be the only protection available. Dust collected beneath fingernails. Loose stones were pushed forward. Saddles, ammunition boxes, and rolled blankets were placed where they could strengthen the low edges of the position. The work continued while enough daylight remained to see the shape of the slope. Around the perimeter, companies faced outward. Inside it, horses and mules crowded into shallow depressions. The animals had traveled hard, and many had gone too long without water. They shifted against one another, pulled at reins, and lowered their heads toward ground that offered nothing to drink. Nearby, wounded men rested beneath coats or blankets. Those able to help checked bandages, passed canteens, and moved quietly between the injured. Medical supplies had arrived with the packs, but the number of men needing attention and the exposed nature of the hill limited what could be done. Every practical task had to continue under the possibility of renewed fire. A soldier might scrape at the earth for several minutes, then stop to watch movement along a distant ridge. A packer might tighten a rope around frightened mules, then lower himself behind the nearest shelter when shots crossed the position. An officer might place a company along one edge and then discover that another section required additional men. The defensive circle was never entirely finished. It became stronger through adjustment. As evening deepened, rifle fire continued in irregular waves. At times, the pressure seemed to weaken. Then shots returned from another direction, reminding the men that Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors could move around the surrounding country, with far greater freedom than the soldiers crowded on the hill. The defenders answered when targets appeared. Ammunition was checked repeatedly. Men opened pouches and counted the cartridges remaining in their loops. Additional rounds from the pack train were carried to the most active portions of the line. Empty boxes accumulated near the center. The note Martini had delivered was no longer physically important to the work being done. No one needed to read, "Bring packs" again. The instruction had already passed into action. The packs were present. The cartridges were being used. What remained from the message was its unanswered purpose. Where was Custer? No reliable messenger came from the north. No officer arrived with an explanation. The 5 companies did not appear on the skyline. The men on Reno Hill did not yet possess the complete story later generations would bring to the battlefield. They knew that Custer had moved north. They knew firing had been heard in that direction. They knew large numbers of warriors had come south from beyond Weir Point. But these facts did not prove, to men living through the evening, that the entire Northern Battalion was gone. Some imagined that Custer had continued farther downriver. Others wondered whether he had been driven east and was making his way toward another part of the expedition. Perhaps he had joined General Terry. Perhaps he remained in a defensive position beyond the visible ridges. Perhaps he would appear at dawn, asking why the rest of the regiment had not found him. Hope did not always take the form of confidence. Sometimes it was simply the absence of proof. As darkness settled, the battlefield became harder to interpret. Distant movement turned into silhouettes. A horse could be mistaken for a rider. A cluster of bushes might appear to shift when the wind moved through it. Men peering over the low earthworks strained to separate real danger from the uncertainty created by fading light. Orders were given in low voices. The animals had to be kept as quiet and controlled as possible. Their movement revealed where the center of the position lay. A frightened mule pulling free could disturb an entire section of the defense. Men held bridles through the darkness. Others lay beside carbines with their heads close to the ground. Sleep came only in fragments. A soldier might close his eyes for a few minutes, then wake when firing began along another edge. Men changed places where possible, so those who had been watching could rest. The wounded murmured, called for water, or remained still beneath blankets. Thirst became one of the most serious enemies on the hill. The Little Bighorn was visible below in daylight, but reaching it required leaving the defensive perimeter and descending exposed slopes. The river seemed close enough to promise relief, and far enough to make every attempt dangerous. Canteens emptied. A man lifted one, shook it, and heard only a faint drop inside. Another poured a small measure into a cup and carried it toward a wounded companion, rather than drinking it himself. The choice was simple and costly. By morning, the lack of water affected men and animals throughout the position. Tongues felt swollen. Dust clung to dry mouths. Horses pulled toward the scent or direction of the river. Water details eventually made their way down under protection, moving through ravines and lower ground where possible. Men carried canteens, containers, and whatever vessels could be filled. Others provided covering fire from above. The journey downward took courage of a quiet kind. A man left the relative shelter of the hill because remaining without water was becoming impossible. He descended with empty containers and returned carrying additional weight, while shots threatened the route. Each filled canteen became a small victory. The water was distributed carefully. The wounded received attention. Men drank enough to continue. Horses and mules could not all be given what they needed, and their suffering remained visible in the center of the perimeter. June 26 brought renewed pressure. In daylight, the defenders could see warriors taking positions along surrounding slopes and ridges. Firing became heavy at times, then shifted elsewhere. Benteen and other officers moved between companies, strengthening portions of the line where the threat appeared greatest. A section might hold steadily for an hour, then become the focus of a sudden advance. Men had to rise from their shallow scrapes, fire with control, and prevent the perimeter from narrowing. The defense depended on movement within stillness. The soldiers could not leave the hill, but they could not remain passive upon it. Cartridges traveled outward from the supply boxes. Water traveled inward from the river. Orders moved along the perimeter. Wounded men were shifted into safer depressions. Animals were gathered again whenever fear drove them against the lines. Hour by hour, the position continued to exist. That fact became its own reward. Reno's command had broken in the valley. The force at Weir Point had been compelled to withdraw. Yet on the hill, the combined companies held through the night and into the next day. The written instruction from the northern battlefield seemed farther away with every passing hour. Its sender remained absent. Its urgent command had been replaced by the immediate routine of survival. Still, men looked north. A rider appearing on a distant crest could renew speculation. A change in firing might suggest that another force was approaching. Dust in the valley could mean warriors repositioning, the village preparing to move, or an army column finally drawing near. Every sign required interpretation. Most produced no immediate answer. By the evening of June 26th, however, the pattern around the hill began to change. Firing weakened. Movement across the surrounding heights became less aggressive. Smoke rose from parts of the valley, and long lines could be seen forming near the encampment. The soldiers watched through the fading light. Lodge poles were lowered. Horse herds were gathered. Families began preparing to leave the Little Bighorn. The pressure on Reno Hill had not ended with a final charge or a clear signal. It was loosening because the immense community below was turning its attention away from the soldiers and toward the long work of moving south. From the bluffs above the Little Bighorn, the first clear sign of change was the lowering of the lodge poles. All through the evening of June 26th, soldiers on Reno Hill watched the immense encampment below begin to lose its familiar shape. Lodges that had stood in broad circles beside the river were taken apart. Hide coverings folded inward. Long wooden poles came down one bundle at a time and were laid beside horses prepared to carry them. The village was leaving. At first, the movement was difficult to interpret. The defenders had spent more than a day expecting another attack. Any shift in the valley might be a preparation to renew the fighting, surround the hill, or draw soldiers away from their position. Men remained behind their shallow earthworks. Carbines stayed close. Officers studied the activity below through field glasses and watched the routes leading south. But the pattern continued. Families gathered the objects needed for travel. Blankets were rolled. Cooking vessels, tools, clothing, hides, and personal possessions were secured in bundles. Travois poles were fastened to horses and dogs. Children were placed where they could ride safely, while older children walked beside relatives or helped guide animals through the dust. The great horse herds had to be collected as well. Riders moved across the grazing areas, turning scattered animals back toward the departing columns. Loose horses resisted, circled, or attempted to return to familiar ground. Men and boys rode around them, gradually bringing the herds into motion. This was not the movement of a defeated military unit abandoning a fixed camp. It was the relocation of a vast community. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne families had fought a major battle and won control of the immediate field, yet remaining beside the Little Bighorn offered no lasting security. Their lodges, children, elders, food supplies, and thousands of horses could not stay beneath the path of the next army force expected to enter the region. Victory created a new decision: leave while the soldiers on the bluff remained contained, or stay and risk being found by additional columns. The village chose movement. Smoke drifted through the bottoms as some fires were extinguished, and others burned among abandoned materials. Dust thickened where horse herds and loaded animals entered the southern routes. Lodge poles rose above the moving lines like thin branches carried across the evening sky. From Reno Hill, the scene seemed almost endless. One group disappeared behind a river bend while another was only beginning to move. Riders traveled along the outer edges, watching the bluffs and protecting the families within the column. Travois scraped over dry earth. Dogs trotted beside the loads assigned to them. Horses carried folded lodge coverings and bundles that contained the ordinary life of each household. The same people who had appeared to army officers as a big village were now becoming a long road of separate families. Their destination was not announced to the men watching from above. The community could divide again once it reached safer country. Some groups might travel toward the Bighorn Mountains. Others might choose different river valleys, hunting grounds, or routes toward relatives. Mobility had protected plains communities long before the 7th Cavalry entered the valley. Now it protected them again. The soldiers could not know whether the departure meant the battle had ended. They saw warriors still watching the heights. Sporadic shots could still come from distant positions. Dust concealed the exact number of people remaining near the encampment. A withdrawal might be genuine. It might also conceal an attempt to draw the defenders down from their prepared ground. No officer wished to repeat the mistake of moving into the valley without understanding what waited there. So the men remained on the hill and watched. The firing gradually diminished. The gaps between reports became longer. Warriors who had occupied nearby slopes began leaving them. The ridges that had been active with movement during the day slowly emptied. The change did not feel like a formal end. There was no messenger carrying terms, and no flag indicating that the fighting was finished. Pressure simply loosened as attention shifted toward protecting the departing community. For the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, the victory carried a meaning very different from the one it would acquire in newspapers and government offices. At the Little Bighorn, warriors had defended a large gathering and defeated separate parts of an attacking regiment. Families had escaped immediate capture. For a brief time, the village could move under its own direction, but the victory did not remove the forces gathering against them. News of Custer's defeat would intensify military operations. More soldiers, supplies, forts, and winter campaigns would be directed toward Lakota and Northern Cheyenne communities. Hunting grounds would become harder to use safely. Horse herds, food stores, and winter camps would become targets of continuing pressure. The immediate and longer consequences, therefore, moved in opposite directions. On June 26th, The people in the valley had won the freedom to leave. In the months that followed, the United States would devote greater strength to limiting where they could go. None of that later history was visible in the evening column. What could be seen was a woman guiding a loaded horse, a rider turning back to watch the northern hills, children moving between bundles and animals, lodgepoles passing slowly through smoke. Each family carried its own portion of the victory and its own uncertainty about what would follow. On Reno Hill, uncertainty remained as well. The defenders still did not know the fate of Custer's 5 companies. The departure of the village could support several explanations. Perhaps Custer had moved north and survived beyond the battlefield. Perhaps he had joined General Alfred Terry's approaching column. Perhaps the warriors were leaving because another army force had appeared. Or perhaps the firing beyond the northern ridges had ended for a reason no one on the hill yet wished to name. Men looked toward the country where Weir had tried to advance. No blue column appeared. Martini could still describe the place where he had left Cook and Custer, but that information was now more than a day old. The handwritten message remained proof that the Northern Battalion had wanted support. It did not reveal what had happened after the messenger rode away. The village continued south into the fading light. Dust softened the edges of the departing riders. The lodge poles grew smaller. Horse herds spread and gathered again as the route narrowed. Smoke remained over the abandoned camp beside the river, marking the place where thousands of people had lived only hours before. By darkness, much of the valley had changed. The lodge circles were open spaces. Cooking fires had gone cold. Trails led away where families had chosen their routes. The soldiers spent another night cautiously watching the emptying country. They did not rush down from the bluffs. Wounded men still required care. The defensive perimeter remained in place. Ammunition stayed near the lines. Morning would bring a different kind of dust. On June 27th, movement appeared from the direction of the northern valley. At first, the men on Reno Hill could not know whether the approaching figures belonged to returning warriors, Custer's missing command, or the army column they had been hoping to see. The answer would bring relief. It would also lead them toward the northern ridges, where Cook's few penciled lines would begin their second life, not as an active order, but as evidence in the long argument over what had happened. The figures approaching on June 27th belonged to General Alfred Terry's column. For the men on Reno Hill, recognition brought relief before it brought understanding. The siege was ending. Additional soldiers had reached the Little Bighorn. Wounded men could receive greater care, and the exhausted defenders no longer had to watch every surrounding ridge alone. Yet one part of the regiment was still missing. Custer's 5 companies had not returned during the night. They had not joined Terry. No courier arrived from the north carrying a new instruction or explaining why the command had remained away. The uncertainty could no longer be left unanswered. Men moved north across the same broken heights that had concealed the battle from Reno and Benteen. They passed Weir Point and continued toward the ridges where dust and smoke had been seen 2 days earlier. There, the absence became fact. Custer's command was found scattered across the northern battlefield. The 5 companies had not withdrawn beyond the valley or joined another army column. They had been overwhelmed. The discovery was recorded by men who had already endured their own fight. They recognized officers, companions, and familiar equipment among the quiet slopes. The work that followed was practical and solemn. The dead had to be identified where possible. Reports had to be sent. The wounded on Reno Hill still needed attention, and the expedition remained in hostile country. No short explanation could contain what had happened. That did not stop people from searching for one. Almost immediately, the battle began changing from lived confusion into disputed history. Officers wrote reports. Survivors compared what they had seen. Newspapers demanded clear causes. Families wanted to know why the regiment had been divided and why help had not reached the northern companies. In that search, Cook's note acquired a new purpose. It was no longer an order directing movement across the battlefield. It became evidence. Years later, The worn message could be placed beneath lamplight beside a map of the Little Bighorn. A hand might smooth the page while another traced lines across the paper map. Here was the route taken by Reno. Here was Benteen's reconnaissance. Here stood the pack train. Here Martini met the returning companies. And farther north lay the ridges where Custer's battalion was found. The handwriting appeared firm enough to settle something. "Come on. Be quick. Bring packs." The words were visible and direct. Unlike distant gunfire or remembered conversation, they had survived in physical form. Anyone could read them, but the note did not contain a clock. It did not record the exact minute Cook wrote it, the full time Martini required to reach Benteen, or how long each later halt lasted. It did not state where Custer expected to be when the three companies arrived. The paper preserved instruction. It did not preserve the moving battlefield around it. Critics of Benteen returned repeatedly to the command to be quick. They argued that the note showed clear urgency and that he should have pressed north without allowing Reno's retreat to delay him. In this view, every pause widened the separation between the surviving force and Custer's companies. The fact that Custer had called for both men and ammunition seemed to prove that support was required immediately. Defenders answered with the scene Benteen encountered. Reno's battalion had come out of the valley shaken, reduced, and in need of protection. Reno was the senior officer present and urged him to remain. The pack train had not yet fully closed the distance. The sender's exact position was unknown, while warriors were moving across the terrain between the two commands. Could Benteen responsibly have ridden past those survivors? Could his three companies have found Custer in time? Would an immediate advance have reached the northern battlefield before its final collapse, or merely added another isolated force to the defeat? The note alone could not decide. In 1879, these questions entered a formal setting during the Reno Court of Inquiry in Chicago. The proceeding had been requested to examine Major Reno's conduct at the Little Bighorn, especially his actions in the valley and on the bluffs. Witnesses were called back into the sequence. Officers described movements, conversations, firing, distances, and decisions made nearly 3 years earlier. Benteen testified. Others recounted what they remembered of Reno's retreat, the halt on the hill, the advance toward Weir Point, and the defense that followed. Martini's ride also became part of the reconstruction. He could confirm that he carried the written message and delivered it to Benteen. His survival gave later investigators access to a path of communication that would otherwise have vanished with Cook and Custer. Yet recollection had limits. One man remembered heavy firing at a particular moment. Another placed it later. One believed the northern battle sounded close. Another could not hear enough to judge its direction. Officers disagreed about the length of pauses, the urgency of conversations, and what could be seen from different points along the bluffs. These differences did not always mean dishonesty. The battlefield had never presented all witnesses with the same view. A rider below a ridge could not see what an officer on the crest observed. A man controlling frightened animals heard different sounds from someone listening in open grass. Time experienced under pressure rarely returned as exact minutes. The court of inquiry gathered testimony, but it did not create a perfect clock. Reno was not formally condemned by the court. Still, debate over his actions continued. Benteen's reputation remained divided as well. Some judged his halt severely. Others emphasized his leadership during the defense and the practical impossibility of carrying out an incomplete order after the situation had transformed. Native accounts added essential perspectives that Army testimony could not provide. Lakota and Cheyenne participants described movements, resistance, and the defeat of Custer's companies from within the battle itself. Their memories showed activity invisible from Reno Hill. They also reminded later historians that the battlefield was not shaped only by decisions made within the 7th Cavalry. Native warriors made rapid choices of their own, shifting between threats, using ravines and ridges, and bringing far greater numbers against isolated groups. Archaeological evidence later added another layer. Cartridge cases, bullets, equipment fragments, and the physical distribution of objects across the northern ridges helped investigators study where firing may have occurred and how positions changed. But archaeology could not recover every spoken command. A cartridge case might show where a weapon was fired. It could not reveal what Custer expected when he sent Martini away. The landscape itself became evidence as well. Historians walked the coulées, measured the routes, studied sightlines, and stood on the heights where officers had tried to understand distant movement. The ground explained why communication failed so easily. It did not identify one single decision that could reverse the outcome. Under the lamp, the old message remained the clearest object in the discussion. Its handwriting could be examined. Its phrases could be quoted exactly. Its repeated postscript could be interpreted again and again. Yet the more carefully the page was studied, the clearer its limitation became. It answered what Benteen was asked to do. It could not prove what he still had time to accomplish. The battlefield order had entered the courtroom and survived every witness who argued around it. Long after voices faded and maps were folded away, the paper remained. Small enough to fit in a hand, large enough to carry the weight of an unfinished argument. And in the years that followed, that fragile page would outlive every urgent purpose for which it had first been written. Now the message is no longer moving. It rests beneath soft museum light, protected from the dust, rain, saddle leather, and rough handling of the afternoon that gave it meaning. The paper has aged. Its surface carries the quiet marks of time, yet the handwriting remains visible. Be quick. Bring packs. The words appear almost calm now. They no longer travel between ridgelines. No horse labors beneath them. No officer waits somewhere ahead. The immense village, the distant firing, and the separated columns have vanished from the space around the page. Only the instruction remains. A visitor leaning over the display can read it in a few seconds. That ease creates the final illusion of the story. Because the words are simple, the decision they produced can also seem simple, but the note was never a complete account of the battlefield. It was Lieutenant William Weir Cook's written version of a verbal instruction given by George Armstrong Custer. Cook reduced a rapidly changing situation to the few phrases a messenger could carry. He named the recipient, described the village, demanded speed, and repeated the need for the ammunition packs. That was all the paper had room to do. It helped Giovanni Martini deliver the command accurately, despite the confusion of the day and the limits of his English. The young trumpeter did not need to remember every word as he crossed the bluffs. He needed only to protect the page, locate Captain Frederick Benteen, and place it in his hands. Martini succeeded. The last clear message from Custer's immediate command reached the officer for whom it was intended. That fact is what makes the note so haunting. It was not lost in a ravine. The messenger was not turned back. The writing did not become unreadable. The order arrived. Yet successful delivery was not the same as successful rescue. By the time Benteen read Cook's lines, the military world behind them had already changed. The empty country of his reconnaissance had become irrelevant. Reno's battalion had entered the valley, withdrawn through the timber, crossed the Little Bighorn, and climbed the bluffs in disorder. The pack train remained behind. Custer's exact position was unknown. The message told Benteen what had been wanted when it was written. It could not tell him what had happened afterward. Every battlefield order depends on more than language. It depends on shared knowledge between the person who sends it and the person who receives it. Both must understand the landscape, the position of friendly forces, the location of the enemy, and the meaning of the destination. It depends on time. The instruction must arrive while the situation it describes still exists. It depends on movement. The sender must remain reachable, or leave enough information for the receiver to follow. And it depends on a world that stays unchanged long enough for obedience to be possible. At the Little Bighorn, that world did not remain still. Ridges hid one command from another. Coulées redirected riders. Gunfire carried without explanation. The immense Lakota and Northern Cheyenne village responded more quickly and in greater strength than the divided 7th Cavalry expected. A note could cross those obstacles. Understanding could not cross them so easily. The repeated request for the packs reveals the problem more clearly than any other phrase. Custer needed speed, but he also needed the heaviest and slowest portion of the regiment. Ammunition had to be carried by mules that stopped when loads shifted, slowed on steep grades, and required escorts to keep them together. To bring the packs was to bring strength. It was also to bring delay. The ammunition did reach organized soldiers. Its boxes were opened. Its cartridges passed into waiting hands. But the men who used them were defending Reno Hill, not joining the 5 companies on the northern ridges. The instruction was fulfilled in one sense and overtaken in another. This is why the message cannot serve as a simple verdict against one officer or as a complete defense of another. It proves urgency. It proves that reinforcement was requested. It proves that Benteen received a direct command to move forward with the reserve ammunition. It does not prove how much time remained. It does not reveal whether a different decision at one particular minute could have reached Custer before the northern position collapsed. The surviving evidence brings us close to the answer, but never completely inside it. Army testimony provides remembered times and conversations. Native accounts describe movements the surviving officers could not see. Archaeology marks places where weapons were fired and equipment was left. The Bluffs still show how easily one body of riders could disappear from another, and at the center lies the small page, preserving clear words inside an unclear sequence. Cook could not later explain what he intended to emphasize. He died with the Northern Command. The officers and men around him left no complete account of what Custer planned after Martini rode away. But Cook's hand survived. The pressure of his pencil remains in the hurried lines. His spelling, spacing, and repeated postscript preserve a few seconds from June 25, 1876, more directly than any later memory could. Martini survived because he carried those lines away. The assignment removed him from the 5 companies before their final fighting. He lived to describe the delivery and became the human connection between the men who sent the message and the officer who received it. He carried more than paper, though he could not have known it at the time. He carried Cook's last surviving words. He carried evidence that Custer recognized the size of the village and wanted the regiment's divided parts brought nearer. He carried a question that would remain after every witness was gone. Under the museum light, there is no motion around the note now. The paper does not tremble with the stride of a horse. Dust no longer gathers along its folds. The sound of rifle fire has faded beyond recovery. The battlefield itself has grown quiet as well. Grass covers the ridges where mounted columns once appeared and vanished. Wind passes through the coulées that delayed messages and concealed movement. The Little Bighorn continues along the valley where the lodge circles stood, carrying water past places that once held thousands of people, horses, fires, and voices. The note survives because it is small enough to preserve. The larger moment cannot be held so easily. Perhaps that is its final meaning. History often leaves us the object, but not the certainty. A page remains while intention disappears. A command survives, while the exact opportunity to obey it becomes impossible to measure. Custer's last message could not save him, not because written words were useless, not because the messenger failed, and not because one short phrase can explain every decision that followed. It failed because the battlefield changed faster than the message could master it. The paper moved faithfully through the hills. The world it described had already moved beyond it, and so the final voice from Custer's column is not a speech or a legend carried on the wind. It is Cook's pencil upon a small piece of paper, asking distant men to hurry and bring what was needed. The men hurried. The packs came. The note endured. Beyond the glass, the old handwriting rests beneath the light, while the ridges of the Little Bighorn settle once more into evening.